The American highway system stretches across over 4 million miles of asphalt, concrete, and gravel. Every night, thousands of truck drivers navigate these dark arteries, carrying the lifeblood of our nation from coast to coast. Most of these journeys are routine, predictable, safe. But sometimes, in the dead of night when fatigue sets in and the world feels different, drivers encounter things that defy explanation. Things that make them question everything they thought they knew about the roads they travel. Tonight, we're bringing you 10 true stories from 10 different states, told by the drivers who lived them. These aren't urban legends passed down through truck stops. These are first-hand accounts from men and women who've spent their lives behind the wheel, who know the difference between highway hypnosis and something genuinely otherworldly. Each story comes from a different corner of America, but they're all connected by one terrifying truth. Our highways hide secrets that most people will never discover. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey across America's most haunted roads. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at a late-night drive the same way again. Hey everyone, want to pick the topic for my next video? Drop your suggestions in the comments, and the most popular one will take the spotlight. Comment now, and let's dive into today's story. Marcus had been running the Dalton Highway for 8 years. The 414-mile stretch from Fairbanks to Deadhorse was one of the most dangerous trucking routes in North America, but the pay was worth it. $34 per mile, sometimes more during winter when most drivers wouldn't dare attempt the journey. But Marcus wasn't most drivers. He'd grown up in Anchorage, learned to handle ice before he could properly handle girls, and he knew every curve, every hill, every treacherous stretch of that frozen highway like it was etched into his DNA. February in Alaska meant 18 hours of darkness. The sun would peak above the horizon for maybe 6 hours, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light before disappearing again into the endless night. Marcus preferred it this way. Fewer tourists, fewer accidents, fewer delays. Just him, his rig, and the hypnotic rhythm of studded tires on ice. He'd left Fairbanks at midnight, hauling drilling equipment to the North Slope. The load was heavy, but well-balanced, and his Peterbilt was equipped with every winter driving aid money could buy. Tire chains, engine block heater, enough emergency supplies to survive a week if he got stranded. He'd made this run hundreds of times, and he'd never had a problem he couldn't handle. The first 100 miles passed without incident. Marcus kept his speed steady at 45, his eyes scanning the road ahead for the telltale signs of black ice or wildlife. The CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was quiet, just the way he liked it. It was around 2:30 in the morning when he first noticed the headlights in his mirrors. At first, he didn't think much of it. Another trucker, probably running the same route, maybe 30 seconds behind him. But as the minutes passed, the lights never got closer, never fell back. They just stayed there, maintaining the exact same distance, matching his speed perfectly. Marcus tried adjusting his pace. When he slowed to 40, the lights slowed. When he sped up to 50, they sped up, always maintaining that precise interval, like they were connected by an invisible tether. He reached for his CB radio. Breaker 19. This is snowplow Marcus northbound on the Dalton at mile marker 120. Got a driver behind me. Wondering if you want to pass or convoy up. Silence. Not even static. Marcus checked his radio, twisted the squelch, tried different channels. Everything seemed to be working fine, but no response came from the vehicle behind him. He glanced in his side mirror again. The headlights were still there, 2 steady points of light cutting through the darkness. Around mile marker 140, the road began a long, gradual descent into a valley. This was one of the more dangerous sections, where crosswinds could push a loaded truck sideways and ice formed in unpredictable patterns. Marcus downshifted, letting the engine brake do most of the work as he navigated the winding curves. The headlights followed every move perfectly. By now, a cold unease was settling in Marcus's stomach. In 8 years of driving this route, he'd never encountered another driver who could match his movements so precisely. Hell, he'd never encountered another driver who would even try. The smart play was to keep your distance on ice roads, not tailgate like some teenager in a sports car. The valley floor was shrouded in fog, a common occurrence where warm springs met the frozen air. Marcus's visibility dropped to maybe 50 yards, forcing him to slow to 35. His headlights carved weak tunnels through the gray mist, illuminating nothing but swirling patterns of ice crystals and exhaled breath from the earth itself. That's when he realized the headlights behind him were gone. Marcus checked all his mirrors, craned his neck to look back through the rear window of his sleeper cab. Nothing, just fog and darkness. The mysterious follower had vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by confusion. There hadn't been any turnoffs for the last 20 miles. No side roads or rest areas where another vehicle could have disappeared. The Dalton Highway was notorious for its isolation. You were either on it or you weren't, and there was nowhere to go but forward or back. Marcus shook his head, chalking it up to fatigue and the weird tricks darkness could play on your mind. He'd driven through stranger things. A few years back, he'd sworn he'd seen the northern lights spelling out words, but his dashcam had recorded nothing but ordinary aurora activity. The human brain wasn't designed for this much isolation, this much darkness. It manufactured mysteries where none existed. He was just reaching for his thermos of coffee when he saw the brake lights. 2 red points of light directly ahead of him in the fog, maybe 100 yards away. Another truck, completely stopped in the middle of the highway. Marcus's training kicked in immediately. He downshifted hard, pumped his brakes to avoid locking up on the ice, and reached for his hazard light switch. The last thing you wanted on the Dalton Highway was a rear-end collision. With his 40,000-pound load, even at 35 miles per hour, stopping distance was measured in hundreds of feet. His truck groaned and slid, but the anti-lock brakes and studded tires did their job. He came to a stop maybe 20 feet behind the other vehicle, close enough to make out details in his headlights. It was a Kenworth, probably 10 years old, pulling what looked like a flatbed trailer loaded with construction materials. The truck was in good condition, not the kind of beater that would break down in the middle of nowhere. But there it was, stopped dead in the middle of the highway with no explanation. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and his CB radio. Breaker 19. This is Snowplow Marcus at mile marker 158 southbound. Got a breakdown blocking the northbound lane. Driver, if you can hear this, I'm coming up to check on you. He climbed down from his cab, his boots crunching on the frozen asphalt. The cold hit him like a physical blow, 40 below zero, not counting the wind chill. At this temperature, exposed skin could freeze in minutes. He pulled his balaclava over his face and walked toward the stopped truck. "Hey!" he called out, his voice muffled by the face mask. "You okay in there?" No response. The truck's engine wasn't running, which was a death sentence in this kind of cold. Even with proper winter clothes, you couldn't survive long in a dead vehicle at 40 below. Marcus approached the driver's side door and knocked loudly. "Driver, you okay?" Still nothing. He tried the door handle unlocked. The door swung open with a creak, and Marcus shined his flashlight inside. The cab was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No personal items, no logbooks, no CB radio, no sleeping bag in the bunk. It looked like it had been cleaned out completely, as if someone had removed every trace of human occupancy. But the keys were still in the ignition. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This didn't make sense. Drivers didn't abandon their trucks on the Dalton Highway. not unless they were picked up by another vehicle. And even then, they'd radio for help first, let someone know where they were. You didn't just disappear into the Alaskan wilderness at 40 below zero. He climbed into the cab and tried turning the key. The engine turned over immediately, settling into a smooth idle. Nothing wrong with the truck mechanically. So why had it been stopped in the middle of the highway? Marcus climbed back down and walked around to the trailer. Standard flatbed, loaded with I-beams and construction materials. Everything properly secured with chains and straps. The trailer's lights were working, brakes seemed fine. It was a perfectly functional truck and trailer, abandoned for no apparent reason. He was walking back toward his own rig when he noticed the footprints. They led away from the driver's side of the abandoned truck, but instead of heading toward the side of the road where someone might try to flag down help, they went straight ahead into the fog. Marcus followed them with his flashlight beam. The prints were clear in the thin layer of snow that had accumulated on the asphalt. Work boots, size 11 or 12, walking with purpose rather than stumbling. They led directly down the center line of the highway, disappearing into the gray wall of fog ahead. Marcus felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Those footprints were leading in the same direction he'd been traveling, toward Dead Horse and the North Slope. But there was nothing out there except 200 miles of frozen wilderness. No towns, no services, no shelter of any kind. Walking in that direction was suicide. He followed the prints for maybe 50 yards, his flashlight beam pushing weakly into the fog. The prints continued in a straight line, never wavering, never showing signs of the confusion or panic you'd expect from someone stranded in this environment. They walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. That's when Marcus heard the footsteps behind him. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. His flashlight beam swept across empty highway, empty fog, empty night. But he was certain he'd heard something, the distinct crunch of boots on ice, matching his own pace, stopping when he stopped. "Hello?" he called out. His voice seemed to be absorbed by the fog, traveling maybe 10 feet before disappearing entirely. "Is someone there?" The only answer was the whisper of wind across ice and the distant idling of the two trucks. Marcus backed toward his rig, keeping his flashlight trained on the fog behind him. Every instinct he'd developed in 8 years of wilderness trucking was screaming danger. Something was wrong here, something beyond a simple breakdown or abandoned vehicle. The empty cab, the purposeful footprints, the sounds in the fog, none of it added up to anything good. He reached his truck and climbed into the cab, locking the doors behind him. Through his windshield, he could still see the abandoned Kenworth sitting in the middle of the road, its hazard lights flashing rhythmically in the fog. He needed to move it or at least radio it in as a road hazard. But every fiber of his being was telling him to get the hell out of there. Marcus reached for his CB radio to try calling for help again. But as his hand touched the microphone, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps on his running board. Someone was climbing up the side of his truck. The door handle rattled as someone tried to open it from the outside. Marcus grabbed his pistol from the glove compartment. He'd carried it for protection against bears and crazy people, never thinking he might actually need it. "Get away from my truck," he shouted. "I'm armed." The rattling stopped. Marcus waited, gun trained on the door, his breathing loud in the confined space of the cab. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the footsteps retreat, crunching away across the ice. He waited another 5 minutes before switching on his CB radio. This time, it crackled to life immediately. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Snowplow Marcus on the Dalton Highway at mile marker 158. I need police assistance and a tow truck. Got an abandoned vehicle blocking the northbound lane and possible." He paused, not sure how to describe what had just happened. Possible suspicious activity. The response came immediately. Snowplow Marcus, this is Alaska State Patrol dispatch. We show no other vehicles in your area. Are you sure about your location? Marcus double-checked his GPS. Affirmative. Mile marker 158. Northbound lane blocked by abandoned Kenworth with construction materials. Stand by, Snowplow Marcus. The wait felt eternal. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the abandoned truck ahead, watching for any sign of movement. The fog was starting to lift slightly, revealing more of the highway ahead. That's when he noticed something that made him question his own sanity. The footprints he'd followed into the fog. They were gone. Not covered by new snow, not blown away by wind, just gone. The asphalt where he'd clearly seen boot prints was now clean, as if no one had ever walked there at all. Snowplow Marcus, this is dispatch. We've got a unit about 40 minutes out. Can you describe the abandoned vehicle? Marcus keyed his mic, but as he looked ahead to describe the Kenworth, his words died in his throat. The road was empty. No abandoned truck, no hazard lights, no construction materials. Just empty highway disappearing into the lifting fog. Marcus, please respond. Describe the abandoned vehicle. He stared at the empty road, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The truck had been there. He touched it, climbed inside it, seen the footprints leading away from it. But now there was nothing except the black line of asphalt stretching toward the north slope. Dispatch, he finally managed. Cancel that request. False alarm. Must have been equipment malfunction. Copy that, Marcus. You okay out there? Marcus looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Yeah, he lied. I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. And he knew that whatever had happened on that fog-shrouded stretch of the Dalton Highway would follow him for the rest of his driving career. Every time he passed mile marker 158, every time fog rolled across the valley floor, he'd remember the empty truck that wasn't there, the footprints that led nowhere, and the sound of someone trying to get into his cab in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Marcus completed his run to Dead Horse, but he never spoke about that night to anyone. Some stories he learned were better kept to yourself, because the alternative, accepting that something impossible had happened on that frozen road, was too terrifying to contemplate. But sometimes, when other drivers talked about strange encounters on the Dalton Highway, Marcus would listen carefully. And sometimes, in their stories of phantom vehicles and mysterious footprints, he'd recognize something familiar. Something that suggested he wasn't the only driver who'd encountered whatever lived in the fog at mile marker 158. The highway, it seemed, had secrets of its own. Jenny Kowalski had been driving truck for 12 years, but she'd only been running the West Virginia coal routes for 6 months. The money was decent, the loads were steady, and she'd gotten used to the winding mountain roads that would have terrified her when she first started driving. But there was something about West Virginia that felt different from other states she'd worked. Maybe it was the history soaked into every hillside, or the way fog rolled down from the mountains like something alive. Maybe it was just the isolation mile after mile of dense forest broken only by the occasional mining town or truck stop. It was a Thursday night in October, and Jenny was hauling 40 tons of coal from a mine outside Beckley to a power plant in Charleston. The route was familiar by now. Take Highway 19 north through the mountains, then pick up Interstate 79 for the final stretch. Simple enough, except that this particular night, the fog was thicker than she'd ever seen it. It had started as wisps around the mountain peaks, but by the time she reached the higher elevations, it was a solid wall of gray that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. Jenny slowed her Freightliner to 30 miles per hour and turned on every light she had. Headlights, fog lights, hazards, clearance lights. She lit up her rig like a Christmas tree and hoped other drivers would see her coming. The radio chatter from other truckers confirmed what she already knew. This was some of the worst fog anyone had seen in years. Several drivers had already pulled over at truck stops to wait it out, but Jenny was on a tight schedule. The power plant expected delivery by 6 a.m., and she was already running behind thanks to a delay at the mine. She'd driven through fog before. She could handle this. The highway wound through the mountains in a series of switchbacks and gradual climbs. Jenny knew every curve, every grade, every bridge along this route. But tonight, with visibility nearly zero, she was navigating more by memory than sight. Her speedometer held steady at 30, and she kept her eyes glued to the white line at the edge of the road. As long as she could follow that line, she'd be fine. Around mile marker 43, Highway 19 crossed the Gauley River on a bridge that local truckers called the Coal Bridge. It wasn't officially named that, but everyone knew what you meant when you said it. The bridge was about 300 feet long, built in the 1960s with a steel superstructure and concrete deck. Nothing fancy, but solid and well-maintained. Jenny had crossed it dozens of times without giving it a second thought. But tonight, as she approached the bridge, something felt wrong. The fog seemed thicker here, almost solid. Her headlights, which had been cutting through the mist reasonably well, suddenly seemed to stop dead about 10 feet in front of her bumper. It was like driving into a gray wall. Jenny slowed even more, down to 20 miles per hour. She could feel the slight rise as her truck began climbing onto the bridge approach. The familiar rumble of tires on the expansion joint confirmed she was in the right place. But she couldn't see the bridge itself, couldn't see the guardrails or the river below or anything else that should have been visible. She was about halfway across when she heard the voices. At first, she thought it was her CB radio, maybe some chatter from other drivers. But when she glanced at the radio, it was silent. The voices were coming from outside, from somewhere in the fog around the bridge. Men's voices, calling out words she couldn't quite understand. They sounded urgent, desperate, like people shouting warnings or calling for help. Jenny rolled down her window, thinking maybe there'd been an accident, someone who needed assistance. The voices became clearer, but they still didn't make sense. The words sounded wrong somehow, like they were being spoken in a language that was almost English but not quite. Almost familiar, but just foreign enough to be incomprehensible. The fog swirled into her cab through the open window, bringing with it a smell that made her stomach clench. It wasn't the clean, damp scent of mountain mist. This smelled like coal dust and metal and something else, something organic and unpleasant, like things that had been buried too long. The voices were getting closer now, coming from multiple directions. Jenny realized with growing alarm that they seemed to be coming from below the bridge, from the river that she couldn't see but knew was there. People calling up from the water, their voices echoing off the concrete and steel. But that was impossible. The Gauley River was 60 feet below the bridge deck, and in October, the water would be freezing. No one would be swimming or boating in this weather, especially not at 2 in the morning in fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand. Jenny pressed her foot harder on the accelerator, eager to get off the bridge and back onto solid ground. But her truck didn't respond. The speedometer still showed 20 miles per hour, but it felt like she was barely moving. The bridge seemed to be stretching out ahead of her, much longer than the 300 feet it was supposed to be. She checked her odometer, trying to gauge how far she'd traveled since hitting the bridge approach. According to the numbers, she should have been off the bridge and back on solid ground 5 minutes ago. But she could still feel the subtle vibration of the bridge deck under her wheels, still hear the hollow sound that truck tires made on the steel superstructure. The voices were all around her now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Men shouting in that strange, almost language, their words bouncing off the fog and coming back distorted. Jenny could hear the desperation in their voices, but she couldn't understand what they were saying or why they seemed to be calling to her. That's when she saw the lights. Not headlights or marker lights or anything that belonged on a highway. These were softer, yellower, like the glow from kerosene lanterns or candles. They appeared in the fog around her truck, bobbing and weaving like they were being carried by people walking alongside the bridge. Jenny's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was wrong, all of it. There shouldn't be people with lanterns on the coal bridge at 2 in the morning. There shouldn't be voices calling from the river below. And there definitely shouldn't be fog so thick that a 300-foot bridge felt like it went on forever. She reached for her CB radio, intent on calling for help, but as her fingers touched the microphone, one of the lights appeared directly in front of her truck. It was a man, or at least the shadow of a man, holding what looked like an old-fashioned mining lantern. He was standing in the middle of the road, directly in her path, and he wasn't moving. Jenny could see him clearly despite the fog, could make out details of his clothing: work pants, heavy boots, a jacket that looked like it belonged in a coal mine from 50 years ago. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could feel him looking at her. Jenny laid on her horn, a long, sustained blast that should have been heard for miles. But the sound seemed to be absorbed by the fog, muffled and distant. The figure with the lantern didn't move, didn't react, didn't seem to care that 40 tons of truck and trailer were bearing down on him. She had maybe 3 seconds to decide. Hit the brakes and risk jackknifing on the bridge, or swerve and risk going through the guardrail into the river below. But as she lifted her foot to slam on the brake pedal, the figure simply faded away, dissolving back into the fog as if he'd never been there at all. Jenny's truck rolled through the space where he'd been standing, and she felt nothing, no impact, no resistance. Just the continued rumble of tires on the bridge deck and the endless gray fog pressing in from all sides. The voices were getting louder now, more insistent. She could almost understand them, could almost grasp the meaning behind the words. They were calling her name, she realized. Not Jenny, but something else, something that sounded like her name but wasn't quite right. They were calling her to join them, to stop the truck and climb down into the fog where they waited. Jenny shook her head violently, trying to clear her thoughts. This was hallucination, had to be. Highway hypnosis combined with fatigue and fog, her brain manufacturing sensory input where none existed. She'd heard of long-haul truckers having experiences like this, especially on isolated mountain roads late at night. But the voices sounded so real, so desperate. And the lights were everywhere now, dozens of them, bobbing through the fog like a procession of miners heading to work, or heading home from work, or heading somewhere else entirely, somewhere that Jenny didn't want to think about. She fumbled for her GPS, hoping it would tell her how much farther to the end of the bridge. But the screen showed nothing useful, just a blue dot sitting stationary on a gray background. No road, no bridge, no landmarks. According to the GPS, she wasn't anywhere at all. Jenny tried her cell phone next, thinking maybe she could call 911, get someone to come and help her figure out what was happening. But there was no signal, not even the single bar she usually got in this part of the mountains. The phone showed no service, with the resigned finality of technology admitting defeat. The fog was starting to get inside her cab now, despite the closed windows. It crept in through the air vents, around the door seals, through gaps she didn't know existed. And with it came that smell of coal, dust, and metal, and something else, something that reminded her of graves and deep places underground. Jenny was starting to panic, really panic, for the first time in her 12 years of professional driving. She'd handled blowouts at highway speeds, black ice in mountain passes, brake failures on steep grades. But she'd never encountered anything like this, anything that made her question the basic reality of what she was experiencing. The lights were closer now, close enough that she could see they weren't lanterns at all. They were something else, something that glowed from within like foxfire or swamp gas. And the figures carrying them weren't quite human, she realized. They moved wrong, their proportions subtly off, like people-shaped shadows that had forgotten exactly how people were supposed to look. Jenny pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing her speed up to 35, then 40. The bridge had to end eventually. Bridges didn't go on forever, no matter what her senses were telling her. Physics didn't work that way, geography didn't work that way, reality didn't work that way. But the bridge kept going, and the voices kept calling, and the lights kept dancing in the fog around her truck like will-o'-the-wisps leading travelers astray. That's when she remembered the story. Old Pete at the truck stop in Beckley had told her about the coal bridge, about something that had happened there back in the 70s. A mining company truck had been crossing the bridge during a storm, carrying a crew of miners back from a late shift. The bridge had been hit by lightning, or maybe there'd been an equipment failure, or maybe it was just one of those freak accidents that sometimes happen in the mountains. The truck had gone through the guardrail and into the Gauley River below. All 12 men on board had died. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The river was too deep, the current too strong, the water too cold. They'd simply disappeared, along with the truck they'd been riding in. Local people said that on foggy nights, you could still see them trying to cross the bridge, trying to get home to families who'd been waiting for 60 years. They carried lights to help them find their way, and they called out to other travelers, hoping someone could help them finish their journey. Jenny had laughed when Pete told the story, filed it away with all the other ghost tales that truckers like to share over coffee and pie. But she wasn't laughing now. Now, surrounded by voices and lights and fog that didn't behave like fog should behave, the story didn't seem funny at all. She was just starting to wonder if she'd be trapped on this bridge forever when she saw something that made her heart leap. A pair of red taillights ahead in the fog. Another truck, moving in the same direction she was, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. Jenny had never been so happy to see evidence of another human being in her life. She accelerated toward the lights, closing the distance as quickly as she dared on the fog-slicked bridge deck. As she got closer, she could make out more details. It was definitely a truck, probably an older Peterbilt pulling a flatbed trailer. The driver was maintaining a steady speed, maybe 25 miles per hour, and his running lights were all functioning properly. A professional driver, someone who knew how to handle dangerous conditions. Jenny reached for her CB radio. Eastbound truck on Highway 19 at the Coal Bridge. This is the Freightliner coming up behind you. How's your visibility up there? The response came immediately, crackling through her speakers with welcome clarity. Freightliner, this is Iron Horse pulling flatbed. Visibility's about 20 feet, but I think we're almost through the worst of it. Stay close and follow my lights. Never had a stranger's voice sounded so reassuring. Jenny keyed her mic again. Copy that, Iron Horse. Appreciate the company. This fog came out of nowhere. Tell me about it, came the reply. Been driving these mountains for 20 years. Never seen anything quite like this. But don't worry, darling. We'll get through it together. Jenny settled in behind the Peterbilt, matching its speed and following its taillights through the gray maze of fog. The voices were still there, still calling from the darkness around the bridge, but they seemed fainter now, less insistent. The lights still bobbed in her peripheral vision, but they felt more distant, like they were acknowledging her right to pass through their domain. Iron Horse, how much farther to the end of the bridge? She asked. Should be coming up any minute now, came the reply. I can see the fog starting to thin out ahead. We're almost home free. And he was right. Jenny could see it too, the fog beginning to break up, revealing patches of clear night sky and the welcome sight of guardrail reflectors marking the bridge's end. The voices faded to whispers, then to nothing. The lights disappeared one by one, winking out like candles being extinguished. Jenny's truck rolled off the bridge and back onto solid mountain asphalt, and she felt a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. She was through it, past it, back in the real world where bridges had beginning and ends and fog behaved like fog was supposed to behave. "Iron Horse, thanks for the escort," she radioed. That was some seriously weird weather back there, but there was no response. Jenny tried again, then checked her CB to make sure it was working properly. The radio was fine, but Iron Horse wasn't answering. She looked ahead, expecting to see his taillights continuing down the mountain, but the road was empty. No truck, no lights, no sign that anyone else had ever been there at all. Jenny pulled over at the next rest area and sat in her cab for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She checked her logbook, her GPS, her phone. Everything seemed normal now, functioning exactly as it should. The fog was clearing rapidly, revealing a perfectly ordinary October night in the West Virginia mountains. But she couldn't forget the voice on the radio, the steady red taillights that had guided her to safety, the professional courtesy of a driver who'd helped her through the worst fog of her career. Iron Horse had been real, had to be real. She'd talked to him, followed him, watched his lights cut through the darkness ahead of her. Yet when she'd needed him most, when she'd wanted to thank him properly, he'd simply vanished into the night like everything else on that impossible bridge. Jenny completed her run to Charleston and delivered her load on time. But she never drove the coal bridge at night again. She'd take the long way around, add 50 miles to her route, burn extra fuel and time rather than cross that bridge in the dark. Because some bridges, she'd learned, connected more than just one side of a river to the other. Some bridges connected the world of the living to something else entirely. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the ghosts on those bridges were friendly ones, drivers who remembered what it meant to help a fellow trucker in trouble. But luck like that, Jenny knew, wasn't something you could count on twice. Ray Santos had been driving cross-country routes for 15 years, and he thought he knew every trick the American highway system could throw at him. Black ice in Montana, flash floods in Arizona, construction zones that went on for 50 miles through Texas. But Nevada had its own special brand of challenge. The kind of straight, empty highway that could hypnotize you into complacency just before it killed you. Interstate 80 through Nevada was 8 hours of nothing. Sagebrush, alkali flats, and mountain ranges that looked close enough to touch but were actually 30 miles away. The locals called it the loneliest road in America, and Ray understood why. You could drive for 2 hours without seeing another vehicle, another building, another sign of human civilization. Just endless asphalt stretching toward a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. Ray was hauling electronics from California to Chicago, running hard to make up time after a delay in Oakland. It was 3 in the morning and he'd been driving since sunset, maintaining a steady 75 through the Nevada desert. His Kenworth was running smooth, the load was well balanced, and he had maybe 5 more hours before he'd need to stop for his mandatory rest break. The fuel gauge was showing a quarter tank when he started looking for a place to top off. He'd filled up in Reno, but that was 3 hours and 200 miles ago. The next guaranteed fuel stop was Elko, still 90 miles ahead, and Ray had learned never to take chances in the Nevada desert. Too many drivers had been found walking along the interstate, their trucks dead from fuel starvation in the middle of nowhere. He'd been watching for exit signs for the last hour, but this stretch of I-80 was notorious for its lack of services. Mile after mile of nothing, broken only by the occasional ranch road or scenic overlook. The CB radio had been quiet for hours. No chatter from other drivers, no traffic reports, no sign that anyone else was sharing this lonely stretch of highway. That's why Ray was surprised when he saw the exit sign appear in his headlights. Exit 216, Desert Springs Travel Plaza, gas, food, lodging 1 mile. Ray checked his atlas, a habit from the days before GPS made everything automatic. According to his map, There shouldn't be any services between Winnemucca and Elko. Nothing but empty desert and the occasional cattle ranch. But maybe the atlas was outdated, or maybe this was a new development that hadn't made it into the guidebooks yet. Either way, it was exactly what he needed. Ray downshifted and took the exit, following the off-ramp as it curved away from the interstate and into the darkness of the desert floor. The ramp was longer than he'd expected, maybe 2 miles of winding asphalt that seemed to snake through low hills and dry washes. Ray kept expecting to see lights ahead, the welcoming glow of a truck stop or gas station. But there was nothing except his own headlights carving tunnels through the night. He was starting to wonder if he'd made a mistake when the road crested a small hill and revealed the Desert Springs Travel Plaza spread out below him like an oasis of light in the darkness. It was impressive, bigger than most truck stops Ray had seen. A main building that looked like it could house a restaurant, convenience store, and maybe even a small motel. Half a dozen fuel islands with modern pumps, each one lit by bright overhead canopy lights. A large parking area with spaces for maybe 20 big rigs, and what looked like a separate area for RVs and cars. But something felt off about the place, though Ray couldn't put his finger on what exactly bothered him. Maybe it was too bright, too perfect, like a movie set version of what a truck stop should look like. Or maybe it was just the isolation. Who built a facility this large in the middle of the Nevada desert, miles from the nearest town? Ray pulled up to one of the diesel pumps and climbed down from his cab. The night air was cool and dry, carrying the familiar sense of sagebrush and distant mountains. But underneath those natural smells was something else, something that reminded him of ozone and burned electronics. The fuel pump was state-of-the-art, with a digital display and credit card reader that looked like it had been installed yesterday. Ray inserted his company fuel card and started filling his tanks, watching the numbers climb on the digital readout. Diesel flowed at the standard rate, and everything seemed normal except for that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. While his tanks filled, Ray looked around the facility more carefully. The main building was lit up like Christmas, but he couldn't see any people through the windows. No customers browsing the aisles, no staff behind the counter, no movement of any kind. The parking lot was empty except for his truck, which struck him as odd for a facility this size on a major interstate route. The fuel pump clicked off automatically when his tanks were full 180 gallons, exactly what he'd expected based on his fuel gauge. Ray replaced the nozzle and waited for his receipt, but nothing printed. He tried pressing the receipt button several times, but the pump seemed to have gone dead, its digital display now showing nothing but blank green numbers. Ray walked toward the main building, thinking he'd pay inside and maybe grab a cup of coffee for the road. The automatic doors slid open smoothly as he approached, revealing a convenience store that looked like something out of a trucking magazine. Clean aisles, well-stocked shelves, a hot food section that smelled amazing, and a coffee bar with at least 6 different blends. But there was no one behind the counter. No cashier, no manager, no other customers. Just empty aisles and the soft hum of refrigeration units. "Hello," Ray called out. "Anyone here?" His voice echoed in the empty store, but no one answered. Ray walked to the counter, looking for a bell to ring or a sign explaining where the staff might be. Behind the register, he could see a small office with the door slightly open. Maybe someone was back there doing paperwork or inventory. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. "I need to pay for fuel." Still no response. Ray walked around the counter and knocked on the office door. It swung open at his touch, revealing a small room with a desk, filing cabinets, and a computer that was running but displayed only a blank screensaver. This was getting weird. Truck stops didn't operate themselves, and they certainly didn't leave their registers unattended in the middle of the night. Ray was starting to wonder if he'd stumbled onto some kind of automated facility, maybe a test site for unmanned retail operations. But that didn't explain the lack of any signage or explanation for customers. And it definitely didn't explain the feeling he was getting, like invisible eyes were watching his every move. Ray decided to leave $20 on the counter for his fuel and get back on the road. Whatever was going on here, he didn't want to be part of it. He'd filled up, which was the important thing, and he could always sort out the payment issues later with his company's fuel card provider. But as he walked back toward the door, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The magazine rack near the entrance was full of current publications, trucking journals, news magazines, sports publications. But all the dates were wrong. Not just wrong, but impossible. The latest issue of Overdrive magazine was dated 3 months in the future. A news weekly showed a date from next year. Every single publication in the rack was dated for a time that hadn't arrived yet. Ray grabbed one of the magazines and flipped through it. The content looked normal: truck reviews, industry news, regulatory updates. But the dates throughout the magazine confirmed what he'd seen on the cover. According to this publication, it was currently January of next year, and the magazine was reporting on events that hadn't happened yet. He was still staring at the impossible magazine when he heard the sound of diesel engines outside. Ray looked through the store windows and saw that the parking lot was no longer empty. 3 big rigs had appeared while he was inside, all of them parked at different fuel islands. Professional-looking trucks, well-maintained and clean, the kind of equipment that suggested experienced drivers who took pride in their work. But Ray hadn't heard them arrive. He'd been in the store for maybe 10 minutes, and in the desert silence, the sound of approaching trucks would have been audible for miles. Yet somehow, 3 18-wheelers had pulled into the lot without making a sound. Ray walked outside, thinking he'd introduce himself to the other drivers. Truckers were usually friendly people, especially in isolated places like this, and he was curious to know if they'd had the same experience he'd had. Unmanned facility, dated magazines, general weirdness. But as he approached the nearest truck, a red Peterbilt pulling a reefer trailer, he realized there was no one in the cab. The engine was running, the lights were on, but the driver's seat was empty. Same with the other 2 trucks, engines idling, everything functioning normally, but no drivers anywhere to be seen. Ray felt his pulse quicken. This was beyond weird now, moving into genuinely frightening territory. Trucks didn't drive themselves, and drivers didn't abandon running vehicles at fuel stops. Something was seriously wrong here, and every instinct Ray had developed in 15 years of long-haul driving was telling him to get the hell out. He jogged back to his own truck, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. As he pulled away from the fuel island, he glanced in his mirrors at the Desert Springs Travel Plaza. The other trucks were still there, still idling at their pumps, still empty of human occupants. Ray drove back toward the exit ramp, eager to get back to the familiar reality of Interstate 80. But as he crested the hill where he'd first seen the truck stop, he looked back one more time. The facility was gone. Not dark, not closed, but completely absent. Where the Desert Springs Travel Plaza had been, there was nothing but empty desert and sagebrush stretching to the horizon. Ray pulled over and grabbed his atlas, checking and double-checking the page that covered this section of Nevada. There was no exit 216 marked on the map. In fact, according to his atlas, the exits in this area were numbered in the 170s and 190s, with nothing in between. He tried his CB radio, hoping to raise another driver who might have seen the truck stop or could explain what had just happened. But the radio was silent except for static. No chatter from other truckers, no traffic reports, no sign that anyone else was sharing this stretch of highway. Ray's fuel gauge still showed full tanks, confirming that something had happened, that he hadn't just imagined the entire experience. He'd put 180 gallons of diesel into his truck, and the fuel was real enough. But where it had come from, and what kind of place he'd found in the Nevada desert, remained a complete mystery. He drove the remaining distance to Elko in a state of confused alertness, constantly checking his mirrors, scanning the roadside for anything else that didn't belong. But the rest of the trip passed without incident, just empty highway and distant mountains and the gradual approach of dawn. At the truck stop in Elko, Ray asked other drivers if they'd ever heard of the Desert Springs Travel Plaza. Most of them looked at him like he was crazy, but one old-timer, a guy who'd been running Nevada routes for 30 years, nodded slowly. "Heard stories," the old driver said. "Usually from guys who've been on the road too long, you know? Desert gets to people sometimes, makes them see things that ain't there. But the stories are always the same big, fancy truck stop that appears out of nowhere, usually when you're running low on fuel. Some guys say it's a good thing, saves them from running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Others say it's something you don't want to find." "What do you mean?" Ray asked. The old driver shrugged. "Way I heard it, some of the guys who stop there don't make it to their next destination. Their trucks get found abandoned on the side of the road, full tanks of fuel, no sign of the driver. Company sends out search parties, but they never find nothing. It's like the drivers just disappeared." Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert air conditioning. How many drivers? Don't know for sure. Could be just stories, could be coincidence. But I'll tell you this, in 30 years of running these roads, I've learned to trust my gut. And my gut says there are some exits you don't take, some places you don't stop, no matter how bad you need fuel. Ray finished his coffee and got back on the road, but he couldn't shake the old driver's words. Had he narrowly escaped something terrible at the Desert Springs Travel Plaza? Were those empty trucks he'd seen the vehicles of drivers who hadn't been as lucky as he'd been? Or was it all just highway hypnosis and desert mirages? His tired brain manufacturing a complex hallucination to explain something perfectly ordinary. Ray never found out for sure. He completed his run to Chicago without further incident, delivered his load on time, and eventually took other routes that avoided that particular stretch of Nevada highway. But he kept the magazine he'd taken from the truck stop, the one with the impossible future date, as a reminder of a night when he'd encountered something that didn't fit into any rational explanation. And sometimes, when he talked to other drivers about strange experiences on the road, someone would mention seeing an exit that wasn't on any map, a truck stop that appeared when you needed it most but disappeared when you looked back. The details were always slightly different state, different name, different services offered. But the core of the story was always the same. The highway, it seemed, had its own way of taking care of drivers in trouble. Whether that care came with a price and what that price might be was something Ray preferred not to think about too carefully. But he never ran low on fuel in the desert again. Tom Erickson had been driving the northern routes between Minneapolis and Duluth for 8 years. Highway 35 was a good run. Steady freight moving iron or in timber products, decent pay, and scenery that changed with the seasons. In summer, the road wound through green forests and past lakes that sparkled like jewels. In winter, it became a corridor of white that tested every skill a trucker could develop. But it was the fall run that Tom loved most, when the maples and oaks turned brilliant red and gold, and the air carried the crisp promise of snow still weeks away. October in Minnesota was trucker heaven, as far as Tom was concerned. He was making a night run from the Twin Cities to the port in Duluth, hauling steel coils destined for a Great Lakes freighter. The load was heavy but well secured, and his Volvo was running smooth and quiet through the darkness. It was just past midnight when he reached the stretch of highway that curved around Lake Minnewaska, a body of water maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide, surrounded by dense forest that had been turning colors for the past 2 weeks. Tom had driven this route hundreds of times, knew every curve and hill by heart. But tonight, something looked different about the lake. Instead of the usual black mirror of water reflecting starlight, the lake was glowing. Not bright, Not like stadium lights or anything that dramatic, but with a soft, diffused glow that seemed to come from beneath the surface. It was the kind of light you might see from bioluminescent plankton in tropical waters, except this was a freshwater lake in Minnesota in October. Tom slowed his truck and pulled into a scenic overlook that gave him a better view of the water. The glow was definitely real, not some trick of moonlight or reflection from distant buildings. The entire surface of Lake Minnewaska was lit from below with a pale, greenish-white light that pulsed gently like a slow heartbeat. He'd lived in Minnesota all his life and had never seen anything like it. Tom grabbed his phone to take a picture, thinking his wife would never believe this story without proof. But when he looked at the phone's screen, the camera showed only black water reflecting normal starlight. The glow that was clearly visible to his naked eye didn't register on the digital camera at all. Tom put the phone away and climbed down from his cab to get a better look. The October air was cool and crisp, carrying the sense of dying leaves and lake water. But underneath those familiar smells was something else, something that reminded him of ozone and electrical discharge. As he stood at the guardrail looking out over the water, Tom noticed that the glow wasn't uniform across the entire lake surface. It was brightest in the center where the water was deepest, and it seemed to be moving in slow, circular patterns like something was stirring the water from far below. That's when he saw the first set of headlights under the water. They appeared near the center of the lake, 2 points of light that looked exactly like the headlights of a vehicle driving along the lake bottom. They moved slowly, steadily, following what might have been an underwater road. As Tom watched in fascination, more lights appeared, dozens of them, all moving in the same direction, all maintaining the same steady pace. It looked like rush hour traffic 60 feet underwater. Tom rubbed his eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on his vision. He'd been driving for 6 hours straight, and night vision could do strange things when you were tired. But when he looked again, the lights were still there, still moving in their orderly procession across the lake floor. He walked back to his truck and grabbed his CB radio, thinking maybe other drivers had seen this phenomenon. Maybe there was some logical explanation that he was missing. Breaker 19. This is Nordic Express northbound on 35 at Lake Minnewaska. Anyone else seeing something unusual on the water tonight? The response came immediately, crackling through his speakers with unusual clarity. Nordic Express, this is Timber Wolf southbound. Just passed your location about 10 minutes ago. Saw the lights too. Strangest damn thing I've ever seen in 20 years of driving this route. Relief flooded through Tom. He wasn't hallucinating, wasn't losing his mind from too many hours on the road. Another professional driver had seen the same thing, which meant there had to be some reasonable explanation. Timber Wolf, any idea what could cause something like that? Maybe some kind of research project or underwater construction. No idea, Nordic. But I'll tell you this, I've been running this route since the early 2000s, and I've never seen anything like it. Whatever's down there, it wasn't there last week. Tom keyed his mic again. You think we should report it to someone? DNR, maybe, or the Coast Guard? Might not be a bad idea, came the reply. But I'll tell you what's really got me spooked. Those lights look exactly like headlights, like there's a whole convoy of trucks driving along the bottom of that lake. Tom looked back at the water, and he had to admit that Timber Wolf was right. The lights did look like headlights, moving in pairs, maintaining consistent spacing and speed. If he hadn't known better, he would have sworn he was looking at traffic on an underwater highway. Nordic Express, this is Timber Wolf. I'm gonna make some calls when I get to the next truck stop. See if anyone knows what's going on out there. You be careful, hear? Something about this whole situation doesn't feel right. Copy that, Timber Wolf. Thanks for the confirmation. Safe travels. Tom climbed back into his cab, but he couldn't bring himself to continue driving just yet. The underwater lights were hypnotic, mesmerizing in their steady progression across the lake floor. He found himself counting them, 23 pairs of lights, all moving at the same speed, all heading in the same direction, toward the northern end of the lake, where Highway 35 crossed over a narrow channel on a bridge that Tom had driven across thousands of times. As he watched, the first pair of lights reached the area directly below the bridge. Tom expected them to continue past, following whatever underwater route they'd been traveling. But instead, they stopped, just sat there, glowing steadily about 60 feet below the bridge deck. More lights joined them, until all 23 pairs were clustered beneath the bridge like vehicles waiting at a traffic light. But they weren't moving anymore, weren't continuing their journey. They were just sitting there, as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He'd heard stories from other drivers, urban legends about phantom vehicles and ghostly traffic jams. But those were just stories, campfire tales passed around truck stops and CB channels. This was something real, something he could see with his own eyes. But what if it was both? What if the stories were based on something that actually happened? Tom tried to remember what he knew about Lake Minnewaska's history. It was a natural lake, formed by glacial action thousands of years ago. But in the 1950s, the state had raised the water level by building a small dam, flooding several square miles of forest and farmland, maybe even flooding some roads. Could those be the headlights of vehicles that had been abandoned when the lake level rose? Some kind of electrical phenomenon caused by metal and batteries underwater for 70 years? It sounded far-fetched, but it was more reasonable than the alternative. Because the alternative was that those lights belonged to vehicles that were still being driven, still following routes that had been underwater for decades. Their drivers long dead, but somehow still making their appointed rounds. Tom was pulled from his speculation by movement on the highway behind him. Another truck was approaching from the south, its headlights visible long before the sound of its engine reached him. Tom watched in his mirrors as the truck slowed and pulled into the overlook behind him. It was a Peterbilt, probably from the 1990s, pulling a flatbed trailer loaded with what looked like logging equipment. The kind of truck you'd expect to see on Minnesota highways, hauled by the kind of driver who'd been working these roads for decades. The Peterbilt's engine shut off, and Tom heard a door slam. In his side mirror, he could see a figure walking toward his truck, a tall man in work clothes and a baseball cap, moving with the confident stride of an experienced driver. The man knocked on Tom's passenger side door. "Evening," he called out. "You seeing what I'm seeing out there on the water?" Tom rolled down his window. "If you're seeing underwater headlights, then yeah, we're seeing the same thing. You ever see anything like this before?" The man, he looked to be in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, shook his head slowly. 40 years I've been driving this route, and I've never seen anything like it. But my grandfather used to tell stories about lights on the lake, back before they built the dam." "What kind of stories?" "Old Norwegian folklore, mostly. He was first-generation immigrant, believed in all kinds of things that didn't make sense to us kids. But he swore that on certain nights, you could see the lights of travelers who'd gotten lost in the woods, still trying to find their way home decades after they'd died." Tom felt goosebumps rise on his arms. "Your grandfather saw this before the lake was created?" That's what he claimed. Said it happened every October, around the anniversary of some tragedy that happened back in the 1920s. A lumber company truck carrying a crew of loggers had gotten lost in a blizzard, never made it home. They found the truck the next spring, but the men were never found. Grandfather said their spirits still traveled the old logging roads, still trying to complete their last run. The man pointed toward the water, where the underwater lights continued their patient vigil beneath the bridge. "When they built the dam and flooded the area, I figured that would be the end of the stories. Hard for ghosts to drive underwater roads, you know? But maybe I was wrong about that. Tom looked at the lights with new understanding and new fear. You think those are the same trucks your grandfather saw? I think there are some things in this world that don't follow the rules we expect them to follow. And I think drivers who die with unfinished business might keep trying to finish it, no matter what gets in their way. The older driver extended his hand through the window. Name's Lars Anderson, by the way. I run timber from the northern forests down to the mills in Minneapolis. Tom Erickson. I haul steel and iron ore, mostly between the cities and Duluth. Erickson, you got Scandinavian blood too. Maybe that's why we can see them. My grandfather always said the old country spirits recognized their own. Tom was about to respond when both men noticed something that made their conversation stop dead. The underwater lights were moving again, but this time they weren't following their previous route. They were rising, slowly but steadily, toward the surface of the lake. Jesus Christ, Lars whispered. They're coming up. The lights grew brighter as they approached the surface, and Tom could see that they were indeed arranged in pairs, spaced exactly like vehicle headlights. But as they breached the surface of the water, they didn't reveal trucks or cars or any kind of physical vehicle. They were just lights, floating 6 feet above the lake surface, arranged in the pattern of a convoy but with no substance behind them. Ghostly headlights attached to invisible trucks, driven by invisible drivers on an impossible road that existed only in memory and legend. The phantom convoy began moving again, following a route that took them directly toward the bridge where Highway 35 crossed the lake. Tom realized with growing alarm that they were heading for the exact spot where his truck was parked. Lars, he said, his voice tight with fear. I think we need to get out of here. Amen to that, Lars replied, already walking quickly back toward his Peterbilt. Some things are better left alone, especially when they involve dead truckers trying to finish their routes. Tom started his engine and put the truck in gear, but he couldn't resist one more look at the approaching lights. They were maybe 100 yards from the bridge now, moving at a steady 25 miles per hour, maintaining perfect formation like a professional convoy. But as Tom watched, he realized they weren't heading for the bridge itself. They were heading for the highway, for the exact stretch of asphalt where he and Lars had been parked. The phantom trucks were going to cross the road, following their remembered route regardless of what obstacles might be in their way, including any living drivers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tom floored his accelerator, his loaded truck responding with the urgency that only comes from genuine fear. In his mirrors, he could see Lars doing the same thing, both of them racing to get clear of the area before the phantom convoy reached the highway. Tom's speedometer climbed past 60, then 70, faster than he should have been driving with a load of steel coils on a winding mountain highway. But speed seemed less dangerous than whatever was approaching from the lake. He was maybe half a mile from the overlook when he saw the lights in his mirrors, not the normal yellow glow of highway lighting, but the pale, cold light of the phantom headlights crossing the road behind him. They moved in perfect formation, 23 pairs of ghostly lights following a route that existed only in the memories of men who died almost a century ago. Tom didn't slow down until he reached the truck stop in Hinckley, 40 miles north of Lake Minnewaska. Lars was already there when he arrived, sitting in the restaurant with a cup of coffee and a 1,000-yard stare that Tom recognized immediately. You see them cross the road? Lars asked as Tom sat down across from him. In my mirrors, yeah. 23 pairs of lights, moving in perfect formation. Same number my grandfather always talked about. Said there were 23 men on that lumber truck. 23 souls still trying to get home. Tom ordered coffee and tried to make sense of what he'd experienced. You think anyone will believe this story? Lars shrugged. Doesn't matter if they believe it or not. We know what we saw. And now we know why smart drivers avoid Lake Minnewaska on October nights. Tom completed his run to Duluth, delivered his load, and eventually took other routes that avoided that particular stretch of Highway 35. But he never forgot the night he'd seen the Phantom Convoy, the ghost trucks following their eternal route through flooded forests and across highways that hadn't existed when they'd first begun their journey. And sometimes, when other drivers talked about strange lights on northern Minnesota lakes, Tom would listen carefully to their stories, because he'd learned that some things in the trucking world couldn't be explained by mechanical failure or weather conditions. Some things required older explanations, darker truths about drivers who'd never completed their final runs. Maria Gonzalez had been driving the desert routes of New Mexico for 6 years, but she'd never gotten used to the feeling of complete isolation that came with driving US 285 at night. The highway stretched from the Colorado border to the Texas line, cutting through some of the most remote and beautiful country in America. During the day, the landscape was stunning: red mesas, ancient rock formations, and skies so big they seemed to go on forever. But at night, it became something else entirely. At night, US 285 became a corridor through a different world, a place where the normal rules didn't always apply. Maria was hauling produce from Colorado to El Paso, her refrigerated trailer loaded with fresh vegetables that needed to reach the distribution center by morning. She'd left Denver at sunset, planning to drive straight through with only fuel stops and mandatory rest breaks. The route was familiar: US 285 south through New Mexico, then west on I-10 to El Paso. 8 hours of driving through high desert and small towns that most people had never heard of. She was making good time, her Freightliner maintaining a steady 65 through the darkness. The CB radio had been quiet for hours. No chatter from other drivers, no traffic reports, no sign that anyone else was sharing this lonely stretch of highway. That wasn't unusual for US 285 at night. The road carried enough traffic during the day, but after 10 p.m., you could drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. It was just past midnight when Maria reached the section of highway that passed through the Carson National Forest. Dense stands of ponderosa pine pressed close to the road on both sides, their branches creating a tunnel of darkness that her headlights could barely penetrate. This was one of the more challenging sections of the route. Winding curves, steep grades, and wildlife that had no respect for 18-wheelers trying to maintain schedule. Maria downshifted as the road began a long climb toward a mountain pass. Her engine temperature gauge held steady, and her Jake brake was ready for the descent on the other side. She'd made this run dozens of times and knew every curve, every grade, every spot where deer might dash across the road without warning. But tonight, something was different. As her truck rounded a sweeping left-hand curve, Maria's headlights illuminated something that didn't belong on a modern highway. Standing at the side of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead, was a man unlike anyone she'd ever seen. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with long black hair that hung loose around his shoulders. But it wasn't his size or his hair that made Maria's breath catch in her throat. It was his skin. The man's entire body was covered in intricate patterns painted in white and red. Not tattoos, but paint ceremonial designs that covered his chest, arms, face, and every inch of visible skin. The patterns were geometric, precise, unlike anything Maria had seen in her lifetime spent in New Mexico. They looked ancient, traditional, like something from a museum display or an anthropology textbook. But this wasn't a museum display. This was a living man standing at the side of US 285 at midnight, wearing nothing but the elaborate paint designs and what looked like a leather breechcloth. In October, at 7,000 feet elevation with temperatures in the 30s, Maria slowed her truck, unsure of what she was seeing or what she should do about it. The painted man didn't move as her headlights illuminated him. He simply stood there, perfectly still, watching her approach with dark eyes that seemed to reflect her headlights like an animal's. As she drew closer, Maria could see more details of the painted designs. They weren't random patterns but seemed to tell a story. Figures hunting, animals running, symbols that looked like mountains and rivers and celestial bodies. It was beautiful work, the kind of artistry that took hours to apply and years to master. But what was someone like this doing on a remote highway in the middle of the night? Maria reached for her CB radio, thinking she should report what she was seeing. Maybe the man was in trouble, maybe he needed medical attention. Standing half-naked in freezing temperatures wasn't something anyone did voluntarily. Not unless something was seriously wrong. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose southbound on 285 at mile marker 247. Got a pedestrian situation here. Looks like someone who might need assistance. But before she could complete her transmission, the painted man moved. He didn't walk or run toward her truck like someone seeking help. Instead, he began to dance. It was the only word Maria could think of to describe what she was seeing. The painted man moved with fluid, rhythmic motions that seemed to follow music she couldn't hear. His feet moved in complex patterns on the asphalt. His arms traced precise gestures in the air, and his whole body swayed in time with some internal rhythm. But he was dancing in the middle of the highway, directly in Maria's path. Maria laid on her horn, a long blast that should have been audible for miles in the mountain silence. But the painted man showed no reaction, no acknowledgement that 40 tons of truck and trailer were bearing down on him. He continued his dance, lost in whatever trance or ceremony he was performing. Maria had maybe 10 seconds to decide. Hit the brakes and risk jackknifing on the winding mountain road, or swerve into the opposite lane and hope no other traffic was approaching from the south. Neither option was good, but swerving seemed like the lesser of two evils. She pulled her truck into the southbound lane, giving the dancing man as wide a berth as possible. As she passed him, Maria looked in her side mirror, expecting to see him continuing his strange ritual at the roadside. But he was gone, not walking away, not running into the forest, just gone, as if he'd never been there at all. Maria pulled back into her own lane and tried to make sense of what she'd just seen. Hallucination seemed like the most rational explanation. She'd been driving for 6 hours, was tired, and mountain highways at night could play tricks on your perception. But the painted man had seemed so real, so detailed, so physically present that hallucination didn't feel like an adequate explanation. She tried her CB radio again. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose southbound on 285. Anyone else see anything unusual around mile marker 247? Static was her only answer. Maria tried different channels but got the same result. Either no other drivers were in range, or her radio was malfunctioning. Both possibilities seemed equally likely on this isolated stretch of highway. Maria continued south, but she couldn't shake the image of the painted man dancing in her headlights. The geometric patterns, the precise movements, the complete indifference to the cold and the danger of standing in the middle of a highway, none of it made sense in terms of normal human behavior. Unless it wasn't normal human behavior. Maria had grown up in Albuquerque, in a family that respected both Catholic traditions and the older spiritual practices of New Mexico's indigenous peoples. Her grandmother had told her stories about the old ceremonies, the sacred dances that connected the living world with the spirit world. Most of those traditions had been lost or driven underground by centuries of cultural suppression. But grandmother had insisted they still existed, still practiced by those who remembered the old ways. But those ceremonies took place in private, in sacred locations far from the eyes of outsiders. They didn't happen on public highways in the middle of the night, unless something had gone wrong, unless the barriers between worlds had become thin, allowing ceremonies from long ago to bleed through into the present. Maria was still pondering these possibilities when she saw the lights ahead. Not headlights or taillights, but something else entirely. Flickering, dancing lights that seemed to move independently of any vehicle or structure. They were maybe a mile ahead, just visible through the curves and hills of the mountain highway. As Maria got closer, she could see that the lights were actually fires. Small campfires or torches, arranged in a circle at what looked like a scenic overlook. But there shouldn't be any camping allowed in this section of the national forest, and certainly not right next to a major highway. Maria slowed her truck as she approached the overlook. The fires were definitely real. She could see smoke rising from them, could make out the flicker of flames against the darkness. But what she saw around the fires made her question her own sanity. There were more painted men, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all decorated with the same intricate patterns she'd seen on the dancer in the road. They moved around the fires in complex formations, their bodies painted in whites and reds and yellows that seemed to glow in the firelight. But they weren't solid. Maria could see through them, could make out the landscape beyond their translucent forms. They were there and not there at the same time, like double-exposed photographs or images reflected in glass. As her truck passed the overlook, Maria caught glimpses of the ceremony taking place around the fires. The painted figures danced and chanted, their voices carrying across the mountain air in languages she didn't recognize. Some carried drums that produced rhythms she could feel in her chest. Others held objects that might have been weapons or ceremonial tools. And at the center of it all, dancing alone in the space between the fires, was the man she'd seen on the highway. His painted body moved with the same fluid grace, but now his dance seemed to have purpose, meaning, connection to the larger ceremony taking place around him. Maria realized she was witnessing something that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist in the 21st century. This looked like a gathering from centuries ago, a spiritual ceremony from a time before highways and trucks and modern civilization had changed the landscape of New Mexico forever. But how could she be seeing it? And why was it happening here now on this particular night? Maria's questions were interrupted by a sound that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whine of Jake brakes from somewhere behind her on the highway. Another truck was approaching from the north, probably running the same route she was, probably about to encounter the same impossible ceremony. She grabbed her CB radio. Northbound truck approaching mile marker 250. This is Desert Rose. You need to be aware of unusual activity at the scenic overlook. Recommend extreme caution. The response came immediately, crackling through her speakers with unusual clarity. Desert Rose, this is Mountain Thunder northbound. What kind of activity are you talking about? Hard to explain over the radio, Maria replied. Just be ready for anything, and don't assume what you're seeing is real. Copy that, Desert Rose. I can see some kind of lights ahead. Looks like maybe a vehicle fire or accident scene. I'm slowing down to investigate. Mountain Thunder, listen to me carefully. Don't stop. Don't investigate. Just keep driving and don't look back. But it was too late. In her mirrors, Maria could see the headlights of the approaching truck slowing as it reached the overlook. The lights wavered, stopped, then began backing up as if the driver was trying to get a better look at what he'd seen. Maria tried her radio again. Mountain Thunder, please respond. What's your status? Silence. Not even static. Maria pulled over at the next safe spot and waited, watching her mirrors for any sign of the other truck. But the highway behind her remained dark, empty of any traffic. Mountain Thunder had simply vanished, along with his driver and whatever cargo he'd been hauling. Maria sat in her cab for 20 minutes, hoping to see headlights approaching from either direction, hoping to raise someone on the CB radio who could explain what was happening on US 285 tonight. But the highway remained empty, the radio remained silent, and the mountain darkness pressed in around her truck like something alive. Finally, she put her truck back in gear and continued south, driving faster than was safe on the winding mountain road. She didn't slow down until she reached the truck stop in Roswell, 90 miles from the spot where she'd seen the painted dancers and lost contact with Mountain Thunder. At the truck stop, Maria asked other drivers if they'd heard any radio chatter from Mountain Thunder or seen any unusual activity on the northern section of US 285. Most of them looked at her like she was suffering from highway hypnosis or too much caffeine. But one older driver, a Navajo man named Joseph who'd been running New Mexico routes for 30 years, listened carefully to her story. "You saw them during Dia de los Muertos season," he said finally. "Day of the Dead. Time when the barriers between worlds get thin, when old ceremonies can break through into the present." "You think what I saw was real?" Joseph shrugged. "Real is a complicated word. Were they physically there? Probably not. But did they exist? Yeah, they existed. Still exist. In the places where memory and spirit meet." "What about the other driver? Mountain Thunder?" Joseph's expression grew serious. "Some ceremonies require participants. Maybe he stopped to watch. Maybe he got too close to something that wasn't meant for modern eyes. Hard to say what happens to people who interfere with old business." Maria completed her run to El Paso, but she never forgot the night she'd encountered the painted dancers on US 285. She changed her route after that, taking I-25 south and adding 50 miles to her trip rather than risk another encounter with whatever existed in the mountains between Espanola and Roswell. Because some roads, she'd learned, carried more than just modern traffic. Some roads were corridors for older journeys, spiritual highways that connected the present with ceremonies and traditions that had been practiced in New Mexico for thousands of years. And sometimes, when conditions were right, those ancient highways intersected with modern ones in ways that could change a driver forever. Danny Rodriguez had been running Florida routes for 10 years, and he thought he knew everything there was to know about the challenges of driving in the Sunshine State. Hurricane season, tourist traffic, summer heat that could melt asphalt, Danny had dealt with it all. But the route from Miami to Tampa through the Everglades had always been his favorite, especially the night runs when traffic was light and the wetlands stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway. US 41, the Tamiami Trail, was one of the most unique highways in America. Built in the 1920s, it cut straight across the heart of the Everglades, connecting Tampa and Miami through 50 miles of swamp, sawgrass, and wildlife that existed nowhere else in the world. During the day, you could see alligators sunning themselves on the canal banks, wading birds hunting in the shallows, and the vast river of grass extending to the horizon in every direction. But at night, the Everglades became something different, something ancient and mysterious that reminded you how thin the veneer of civilization really was in South Florida. Danny was hauling citrus from the groves around Lake Okeechobee to the port in Tampa, his refrigerated trailer loaded with oranges and grapefruits destined for ships bound for Europe. It was a good load, profitable and not too heavy, and the October weather was perfect for driving, cool enough that his engine wouldn't overheat, warm enough that he didn't need to worry about frost on the windshield. He'd left Miami at 10 p.m., planning to reach Tampa by sunrise with time to spare before the port opened. The first part of the trip was routine city traffic, suburban sprawl, the gradual transition from urban development to agricultural land. But once he reached the true Everglades, the world changed completely. On both sides of the highway, the landscape opened into an endless expanse of wetlands that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. Water and sawgrass and scattered islands of trees, all bathed in moonlight that made everything look silver and ethereal. It was beautiful in a way that few places on Earth could match, but it was also slightly unsettling, like driving through a landscape that belonged to another planet. Danny had made this run hundreds of times, but he never got tired of the view. Even at night, even when he couldn't see much beyond his headlights, He could feel the vastness of the Everglades surrounding him. It was humbling in a way that city drivers never experienced. The highway ran straight as an arrow through the wetlands, elevated on a causeway that kept it above the seasonal floods. On the south side of the road, a canal ran parallel to the highway, part of the drainage system that had been built to make construction of the Tamiami Trail possible. The canal was maybe 30 feet wide and lined with concrete, designed to carry excess water during the rainy season and provide a buffer between the highway and the true wilderness beyond. Danny was about halfway across the Everglades when he first heard the voices. At first, he thought it was his CB radio picking up chatter from other drivers. But when he glanced at the radio, it was silent, its LED display showing only empty channels. The voices were coming from outside, from somewhere in the darkness beyond his windows. Danny rolled down his driver's side window and listened more carefully. The voices were definitely real, multiple people talking, maybe arguing, in what sounded like Spanish mixed with something else, something he couldn't identify. The words drifted across the water from the canal that ran alongside the highway, carried by the still night air of the Everglades. But there shouldn't be anyone out there. The canal was part of a restricted area, off-limits to recreational boating or fishing. And even if someone was out there illegally, what would they be doing in the middle of the night in one of the most remote parts of South Florida? Danny slowed his truck and pulled over at a scenic overlook that offered a better view of the canal. He'd driven past this spot thousands of times during the day and had never seen anything more interesting than the occasional alligator or wading bird. But tonight, something was different. The canal was full of boats. Not modern boats, but old ones. Wooden vessels that looked like they belonged in a museum or a historical reenactment. Some were small, maybe canoes or fishing boats, but others were larger, capable of carrying a dozen people or more. They moved slowly through the dark water, their occupants speaking in those strange mixed languages that seemed to blend Spanish with words from other tongues entirely. Danny grabbed his binoculars from the glove compartment and focused on the nearest boat. What he saw made him question his own sanity. The people in the boats weren't dressed in modern clothing. They wore rough cotton shirts and pants, broad-brimmed hats, and boots that looked like they'd been made by hand. The men carried tools that looked like farming implements or construction equipment, but designed in styles that hadn't been used in decades. And their faces, visible in the moonlight, had the weathered, desperate look of people who'd been working too hard for too long. Danny counted maybe 20 boats in the convoy, all heading north through the canal in the same direction he was traveling on the highway. But that was impossible. The canal didn't connect to anything significant to the north, just more Everglades and eventually the agricultural areas around Lake Okeechobee. There was no reason for anyone to be making this journey, especially not in antique boats in the middle of the night, unless they weren't making the journey voluntarily. Danny had lived in South Florida long enough to know the darker chapters of the region's history. The Everglades had been built by immigrant labor, much of it provided by people who'd had few other choices. Cuban refugees, Haitian migrants, Mexican workers, all drawn to Florida by promises of work and opportunity that often turned out to be lies. Many of those workers had simply disappeared, lost to accidents, disease, or violence that was never properly investigated or reported. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves throughout the Everglades, their stories forgotten by everyone except the families they'd left behind. But what if they hadn't been forgotten by everyone? What if the land itself remembered? Danny was still trying to make sense of what he was seeing when he noticed that some of the boats were slowing down, pulling over to the concrete banks of the canal directly below his position at the scenic overlook. The occupants were getting out, climbing onto the narrow service road that ran alongside the canal. They were walking toward the highway. Danny put his truck in gear and pulled back onto US 41, not wanting to find out what the people from the boats might want with a lone trucker parked at a remote overlook. But as he accelerated away from the area, he could see them in his mirrors, dozens of figures climbing up from the canal, their antique clothing and desperate faces visible in his taillights. They weren't trying to flag him down or ask for help. They were just watching him go, standing in a silent line along the roadside like witnesses to something he couldn't understand. Danny tried his CB radio, hoping to raise another driver who might have seen the same thing. Breaker 19, this is Citrus King eastbound on 41 through the Everglades. Anyone else seeing unusual activity on the canal tonight? The response came immediately, but it wasn't from another trucker. It was a voice speaking in heavily accented Spanish, the words crackling through his speakers with unusual clarity. "Señor, you must not stop. You must not look back. We are still working, still trying to reach home." Danny felt ice water in his veins despite the warm Florida air. "Who is this? What do you mean, still working? We came to build the road, to drain the swamps, to make the land safe for your people. But the work killed us, and our bodies were left in the mud. Now we can only travel at night, when the barriers are thin." Danny's hands shook as he keyed his microphone. "This isn't real. This is some kind of sick joke. Real is what you make it, Señor. We are real to ourselves, real to the land that holds our bones. And tonight, we are real to you." The voice faded to static, leaving Danny alone with the darkness and the growing certainty that he'd encountered something that couldn't be explained by rational means. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his speed up to 70 despite the winding nature of the highway through the wetlands. But he couldn't outrun what he'd seen, couldn't forget the desperate faces of the people in the boats or the knowledge that he was driving across land that had been built with the blood and bones of workers whose names were never recorded in any official history. As he drove, Danny began to notice more details that he'd missed on previous trips through the Everglades. Service roads that led into the darkness, connecting to nothing that appeared on any map. Construction equipment that looked abandoned but showed no signs of rust or decay despite being exposed to the humid Florida climate for decades. Work camps that appeared empty during the day but seemed to glow with soft light when glimpsed from the corner of his eye at night. The Tamiami Trail, Danny realized, wasn't just a highway through the Everglades. It was a monument to the people who died building it, a memorial constructed from their own sacrifice. And on certain nights, when conditions were right, those people returned to continue the work that had killed them, still trying to complete the journey that would take them home. Danny was maybe 10 miles from the eastern edge of the Everglades when he saw the checkpoint ahead. It looked official, flashing lights, uniformed officers, cars pulled over for inspection. But as Danny got closer, he realized that something was wrong with the scene. The police cars were too old, their designs from the 1940s or 1950s. The uniforms were wrong too, cut in styles that hadn't been used by modern law enforcement for generations. And the officers themselves moved with the same desperate, urgent quality he'd seen in the faces of the people in the boats. Danny tried to slow down, thinking he'd be expected to stop for inspection like any other driver encountering a checkpoint. But as his truck approached the line of stopped vehicles, one of the officers waved him through without stopping, without asking for papers or identification. The officer's face was visible in Danny's headlights as he passed, and what he saw made him understand that this checkpoint wasn't for modern traffic. The man's features were weathered by decades of Florida sun. His eyes held the weary look of someone who'd been working the same job for far too long, and his uniform bore stains that looked suspiciously like the dark water of Everglades canals. This was a checkpoint for the dead, processing the endless stream of spirits who'd never completed their journeys through the wetlands of South Florida. Danny didn't stop driving until he reached the truck stop in Fort Myers, 40 miles east of the Everglades and safely back in the world of modern civilization. But even there, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of contemporary trucking, he couldn't shake the images of what he'd seen in the darkness. He asked other drivers if they'd ever encountered anything unusual while crossing the Everglades at night. Most of them looked at him like he was suffering from too much caffeine or not enough sleep. But one older Cuban driver named Carlos listened carefully to his story. "My grandfather worked on the Tamiami Trail," Carlos said finally, "back in the 20s when they were building it through the swamps. He used to tell stories about the men who died during construction, how their ghosts still walked the service roads at night, still trying to finish the work they'd started." "Your grandfather saw them?" "He said he did. Said they worked all night, every night, trying to build roads that would take them back to the families they'd left behind. But the roads always led deeper into the swamps, never back to the world of the living." Danny completed his run to Tampa, but he never drove the Tamiami Trail at night again. He'd take I-75 instead, adding an hour to his trip rather than risk another encounter with the workers who'd never finished their shift in the Everglades. Because some roads, he'd learned, were built with more than just concrete and asphalt. Some roads were built with dreams and desperation and the lives of people who trusted others to keep them safe. And sometimes, on certain nights, those people returned to claim what was owed them, not money or recognition, but simply the chance to complete the journey home. Jake Morrison had been running the Rocky Mountain routes for 12 years, and he prided himself on knowing every pass, every grade, every potentially dangerous stretch of highway from Denver to Salt Lake City. Colorado's mountain highways were some of the most challenging in the country. Steep grades, unpredictable weather, and elevations that could leave flatlanders gasping for breath. But they were also some of the most beautiful, especially in October when the aspen trees turned gold and the snow-capped peaks looked like something from a postcard. Jake was hauling auto parts from Detroit to a distributor in Grand Junction, his Peterbilt loaded with transmission components and engine blocks that represented 6 figures worth of machinery. The route was familiar: I-70 west from Denver, up through the Eisenhower Tunnel, then down the western slope to Grand Junction. It was a good run, steady freight that paid well enough to justify the challenges of mountain driving. He'd left Denver at midnight, planning to reach Grand Junction by dawn with time to spare before the distributor opened. The first part of the trip was routine: suburban sprawl, foothills, the gradual climb toward the Continental Divide. But once he reached the true mountains, the world changed completely. At 11,000 feet, the air was thin enough that his engine had to work harder to maintain power. The October night was clear and cold, with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Jake had made this run hundreds of times, but he never got tired of the view from the high country, even at night when most of the scenery was hidden in darkness. The Eisenhower Tunnel was ahead, that mile-long bore through the Continental Divide that allowed Interstate 70 to cross the Rockies year-round. Jake downshifted as he approached the tunnel entrance, his truck joining the line of vehicles making the crossing. The tunnel was well-lit and ventilated, a marvel of engineering that had made cross-country trucking through Colorado possible even in the worst weather. But tonight, something was wrong. As Jake entered the tunnel, he noticed that the lighting seemed dimmer than usual, the familiar white walls appearing gray and shadowy. The ventilation system, normally so effective that you barely noticed you were in an enclosed space, seemed to be struggling. The air felt thick, stale, like it hadn't been changed in hours. Jake's truck was maybe halfway through the tunnel when he realized he was alone. The other vehicles that had entered ahead of him and behind him had simply vanished. His headlights illuminated empty tunnel ahead. His mirrors showed empty tunnel behind. The massive bore that should have been filled with the steady stream of cross-country traffic was completely deserted except for his single truck. That was impossible. The Eisenhower Tunnel carried thousands of vehicles every day, and night traffic was usually steady even at this hour. You didn't just suddenly find yourself alone in one of the busiest mountain passes in the country. Jake tried his CB radio, hoping to raise another driver or maybe get a traffic report that would explain what was happening. But the radio was silent except for static, No chatter from other truckers, no emergency broadcasts, no sign that the outside world still existed. The tunnel seemed to be getting longer. Jake checked his odometer, trying to gauge how far he'd traveled since entering the bore. According to the numbers, he should have been through the tunnel and starting his descent down the western slope 5 minutes ago. But he was still surrounded by concrete walls and artificial lighting, still driving through what felt like an endless underground passage. Jake slowed his truck and tried to make sense of what was happening. The Eisenhower Tunnel was 1.7 miles long, a distance he'd covered thousands of times at speeds ranging from 30 to 60 miles per hour, depending on traffic conditions. He knew exactly how long it should take to cross, could time it to the minute. But tonight, the tunnel stretched on, showing no sign of ending. That's when he saw the exit sign. Exit 205, Silver Creek Pass, scenic route 2 miles. Jake stared at the sign in confusion. There was no exit 205 in the Eisenhower Tunnel. There were no exits at all. The tunnel was a straight shot from east to west with no side passages or alternate routes. And Silver Creek Pass wasn't a real place, at least not anywhere in Colorado that Jake had ever heard of. But the exit was there, clearly marked and properly lit, with an off-ramp that curved away from the main tunnel into darkness. Jake slowed his truck even more, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to ignore the impossible exit and continue straight ahead, to find his way back to the real world and the familiar route to Grand Junction. But the tunnel ahead showed no sign of ending, and the exit offered the only alternative to driving forever through an underground passage that had somehow become longer than it was supposed to be. Jake made his decision and took the exit. The off-ramp curved sharply to the right, climbing steeply through what felt like solid rock. Jake's headlights illuminated rough-hewn walls that looked like they'd been carved by hand rather than modern tunneling equipment. The air grew colder as he climbed, and his altimeter showed an elevation gain that shouldn't have been possible inside a mountain. After maybe 5 minutes of climbing, the tunnel opened onto a mountain pass unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It was daylight outside, bright afternoon sunlight that had no business existing at 3 in the morning. The landscape was Colorado high country. Snow-capped peaks, alpine meadows, stands of aspen and pine, but everything looked wrong somehow. Too perfect, too pristine, like a landscape that had never been touched by modern development. The road itself was different too. Instead of modern asphalt and concrete, Jake found himself driving on what looked like an old mountain highway from the 1940s or 1950s. 2 lanes of cracked pavement with no guardrails, no center line, no modern safety features. The kind of road that had been used to cross the Rockies before Interstate 70 existed, when mountain driving was a genuine adventure that could kill you if you made a mistake. Jake checked his GPS, hoping it would tell him where he was and how to get back to familiar territory. But the screen showed only a blue dot sitting in the middle of gray nothing. No roads, no landmarks, no indication that he was anywhere at all. His CB radio crackled to life with a voice he didn't recognize. Eastbound truck on Silver Creek Pass, this is Rocky Mountain Express. You look lost, driver. Jake grabbed his microphone. Rocky Mountain Express, this is Auto Parts Jake. I think I took a wrong turn somewhere. Can you tell me how to get back to I-70? I-70? The voice sounded confused. Never heard of it. You mean the old Denver Grand Junction Highway? That's about 20 miles south of here, but you'd have to go back through Rabbit Ears Pass to reach it. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Rabbit Ears Pass was a real place, but it was nowhere near the Eisenhower Tunnel. It was way up north, near the Wyoming border, on a completely different route through the mountains. If he was near Rabbit Ears Pass, he was at least 100 miles from where he should be. Rocky Mountain Express. What year is it? The question sounded crazy even as Jake asked it, but the response made his blood run cold. What kind of question is that? It's 1952, of course. October 15th, to be exact. "You feeling okay, driver?" Jake stared at his radio in disbelief. 1952. That was 70 years ago, before the interstate highway system existed, before modern trucking regulations, before GPS and CB radios and most of the technology that made long-haul trucking possible. But he was talking to someone on a CB radio, in a truck that was running on a mountain pass that shouldn't exist, in weather that contradicted everything he knew about time and geography. "Rocky Mountain Express, describe your truck for me." "Running a 48 Peterbilt, pulling a flatbed loaded with mining equipment bound for the Climax mine." "What about you?" Jake looked at his own truck, a 2018 Peterbilt with every modern convenience money could buy. Electronic logs, satellite communication, emissions controls that hadn't been invented in 1952. If he really was talking to a driver from 70 years ago, how was the communication even possible? "I'm in a 2018 Peterbilt pulling auto parts," Jake replied, not sure what else to say. 2018? That's a hell of a way in the future. "You sure you're feeling okay?" Before Jake could respond, he saw another truck approaching from the opposite direction. It was indeed an old Peterbilt, probably from the late 1940s, with the high cab and exposed engine that characterized trucks from that era. The driver waved as they passed, a friendly gesture that truckers had been exchanging for decades. But in his mirrors, Jake watched the old Peterbilt fade away like a mirage, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. Either he was hallucinating, or he'd somehow encountered a ghost from the early days of Rocky Mountain trucking. Jake continued along the impossible mountain pass, passing through landscape that looked like Colorado but felt like something from a dream or a half-remembered story. The road wound through high meadows and dense forests, past mining camps that looked abandoned but showed no signs of decay, around lakes that reflected a sky that couldn't exist at 3 in the morning. He was starting to wonder if he'd be trapped on this timeless highway forever when he saw a familiar sight ahead. A modern interstate highway sign. I-70 West, Grand Junction, 45 miles. Jake had never been so happy to see interstate signage in his life. He followed the ramp that connected Silver Creek Pass to I-70, feeling like he was returning to the real world after a journey through some alternate dimension. But as his truck merged with modern interstate traffic, Jake looked back toward the mountains where Silver Creek Pass should have been. There was nothing there, no exit, no signs, no indication that the impossible highway had ever existed. Just the familiar landscape of western Colorado and the steady stream of traffic heading toward Grand Junction. Jake's GPS came back to life, showing his location on I-70 about 40 miles east of Grand Junction. According to the system, he'd lost maybe 20 minutes somewhere between the Eisenhower Tunnel and his current position. Not enough time to have driven the Silver Creek Pass route, but exactly the amount of time it should have taken to cross the Continental Divide on the normal interstate route. Jake tried his CB radio, hoping to raise Rocky Mountain Express and get some explanation for what had just happened. But the radio was back to its normal chatter, modern truckers discussing weather conditions, traffic reports, and the usual concerns of contemporary long-haul driving. No voices from 1952, no ghost trucks from the early days of mountain trucking. Jake completed his run to Grand Junction, delivered his load on time, and eventually took other routes that avoided the Eisenhower Tunnel late at night. But he never forgot his journey along Silver Creek Pass, the highway that existed outside of normal time and geography. He researched the history of Rocky Mountain trucking, looking for references to Silver Creek Pass or drivers who'd reported similar experiences. What he found was fragmentary but intriguing stories from the 1950s and 1960s about truckers who'd gotten lost in the mountains and found themselves on roads that didn't appear on any map, talking to drivers from different eras, experiencing time in ways that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. Most of those stories had been dismissed as highway hypnosis or altitude sickness, the kind of hallucinations that could affect people driving at high elevation with insufficient oxygen. But Jake knew what he'd experienced was more than hallucination. He'd driven on roads that connected different decades, talked to drivers who'd been dead for 70 years, seen landscape that existed only in the memories of people who'd crossed the Rockies when trucking was still young and dangerous and completely dependent on individual skill and luck. The mountains, Jake concluded, had their own sense of time, their own logic that didn't conform to the rules of the modern world. And sometimes, when conditions were right, they allowed modern drivers to experience what trucking had been like in the early days, when every mountain pass was an adventure and every successful crossing was a victory against odds that could kill you without warning. But knowledge like that came with a price. Jake never felt completely comfortable driving mountain routes after dark, never quite trusted that the familiar highways would stay familiar, never forgot that somewhere in the Colorado Rockies, there was a pass where time moved differently and the ghosts of early truckers still made their runs through landscape that belonged to an earlier, more dangerous age of American trucking. Sarah Chun had been driving the Northeast Corridor for 8 years, but she'd only been running the Maine coastal routes for 6 months. The pay was good. Seafood distributors needed reliable drivers who could handle the challenging roads along the Rocky Coast. But the routes were unlike anything she'd experienced in her trucking career. Narrow roads that had been designed for horse-drawn wagons, steep grades that dropped directly into the Atlantic Ocean, and weather that could change from clear skies to impenetrable fog in a matter of minutes. Route 1 along the Maine coast was particularly challenging, especially the section between Bar Harbor and Calais that wound through some of the most remote and beautiful country on the East Coast. During the day, the scenery was spectacular: rocky cliffs, hidden coves, lighthouses perched on granite promontories, and small fishing villages that looked like they'd been frozen in time. But at night, especially during the October fog season, the coastal highway became something entirely different. At night, Route 1 became a passage through a world where the past and present existed side by side, where the ghosts of maritime Maine walked the same roads that modern truckers used to haul their loads to market. Sarah was making a night run from Bangor to a seafood distributor in Machias, her refrigerated trailer loaded with lobster, clams, and fresh fish that needed to reach the processing plant by dawn. The route was familiar by now: Route 1A through Ellsworth, then Route 1 along the coast through small towns with names like Cherryfield, Millbridge, and Jonesport. 40 miles of winding coastal highway that required constant attention but offered some of the most beautiful scenery in New England. She'd left Bangor at midnight, planning to reach Machias with time to spare before the plant opened. The first part of the trip was routine inland roads through forests and small towns, the gradual approach to the coast where the salt air would announce the proximity of the Atlantic Ocean. But once she reached the true coastal section, the world changed completely. Fog rolled in from the ocean like a living thing, thick and gray and so dense that Sarah's headlights seemed to stop dead maybe 20 feet in front of her bumper. This was Maine coastal fog at its worst, the kind of weather that could reduce visibility to zero and trap unwary travelers for hours or even days. Sarah slowed her Freightliner to 30 miles per hour and turned on every light she had. Headlights, fog lights, hazards, clearance lights. She lit up her rig like a Christmas tree and hoped other drivers would see her coming. The CB radio was full of chatter from truckers and local drivers, all complaining about the sudden fog bank and comparing notes on road conditions. Southbound Route 1 near Millbridge. How's visibility down there? Sarah asked on the CB. Terrible, came the immediate reply. Can't see past my own headlights. This stuff came out of nowhere about an hour ago. Sarah settled in for a long, slow journey to Machias. Maine coastal fog was notorious for its unpredictability. It could lift as suddenly as it appeared, or it could linger for days, stranding drivers at truck stops and rest areas until weather conditions improved. She was maybe 5 miles south of Millbridge when she first saw the light in the fog ahead. At first, she thought it was another vehicle, maybe a car or truck with its hazards on, pulled over to wait out the worst of the weather. But as Sarah got closer, she realized the light was wrong somehow. It wasn't the steady flash of emergency lights or the bright white glow of modern headlights. This was a softer, yellower light that seemed to flicker like a flame, like the light from an old-fashioned lantern. Sarah slowed even more, trying to make out details through the thick fog. The light was definitely moving, swaying back and forth as if it were being carried by someone walking along the roadside. But who would be walking on Route 1 at 2 in the morning in fog so thick you could barely see your own feet? As she drew closer, the light became clearer, and Sarah could make out the figure carrying it. It was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. Wool pants, heavy boots, a thick jacket that looked hand-knitted, and a cap that marked him as someone from rural Maine, probably from a fishing or farming family. But what was a child doing on a dangerous coastal highway in the middle of the night, in weather that had trapped experienced drivers? Sarah pulled over and rolled down her window. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The boy turned toward her truck, and Sarah saw his face clearly for the first time. He was pale, almost translucent in the lantern light, with dark eyes that seemed much older than his apparent age. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent that sounded like old-time Maine, the kind of speech pattern that had mostly disappeared as television and modern communication homogenized regional dialects. "You shouldn't be on this road tonight, miss. The fog brings out things that are better left alone." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "What do you mean? What kinds of things?" The boy lifted his lantern higher, and in its flickering light, Sarah could see other figures moving in the fog behind him. Adults, maybe a dozen of them, all dressed in the same old-fashioned clothing, all carrying lanterns or torches that cast shifting shadows in the gray mist. "The drowned ones," the boy said simply. "They walk the coast road when the fog comes in, looking for the ships that never made it home. Sometimes they mistake modern vehicles for the vessels they're seeking." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was impossible, all of it. Children didn't appear on remote highways in the middle of the night carrying antique lanterns and talking about drowned sailors. But the boy seemed real enough, solid enough, and the other figures in the fog were definitely there, moving with purpose through the thick mist. "Who are you?" Sarah asked. "Name's Timothy Morse. I've been walking this road since 1847, the night my father's fishing boat went down in a storm off Machias Bay. Been looking for him ever since, him and the rest of the crew." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. 1847. That was almost 200 years ago, decades before Route 1 existed, before modern roads of any kind had been built along this section of the Maine coast. If the boy was telling the truth, he'd been walking these roads since before they were roads, following some internal compass that led him to search for a father who'd been dead for centuries. "Timothy, your father isn't coming back. The boat went down a long time ago." The boy's expression grew sad, but not surprised. "I know that, miss. Known it for years. But knowing and accepting are different things. And besides, there are others who need finding. Others who got lost in the fog and never made it home." As if summoned by his words, more figures appeared in the mist around Sarah's truck. Men and women in clothing from different eras, some dressed like 19th century fishermen, others in more modern attire that suggested they were from the mid-20th century. All of them carried lights. All of them moved with the purposeful urgency of people searching for something they'd lost. "They're all looking for someone," Timothy explained. "Fishermen looking for their boats, wives looking for husbands who went to sea, children looking for parents who never came home from a voyage. The fog brings them out, gives them hope that tonight might be the night they finally find what they've been seeking." Sarah realized she was looking at the accumulated maritime tragedies of 2 centuries of Maine coastal history. Every fishing boat that had gone down in a storm, every merchant vessel that had been wrecked on the rocky coast, every life that had been claimed by the unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. They were all represented in the crowd of figures moving through the fog around her truck. "How many of you are there?" she asked. Timothy shrugged, a gesture that looked strange on such a young boy discussing such ancient sorrows. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. New ones join us all the time. Maine coast claims lives every year. Always has, always will. But most of the searchers eventually find peace, eventually stop walking the roads. I'm one of the few who's been at it since the beginning." "Why haven't you found peace?" "Because I made a promise," Timothy said. "The night the storm hit, I promised my father I'd keep the light burning until he came home. Been keeping that promise ever since." Sarah looked at the lantern in the boy's hand, at the steady flame that seemed impervious to the fog and wind. "That's the same lantern?" "Same flame anyway. Never let it go out. Not once in 177 years. It's what lets me help the others. What lets me guide lost souls to where they need to be." The other figures were getting closer now, their own lights creating a constellation of flickering points in the fog around Sarah's truck. She could see their faces more clearly. Weathered men with the look of professional fishermen, worried women still wearing the clothes they'd put on to wait for boats that never returned, children clutching toys or personal items that had once belonged to lost family members. "They think your truck might be a ship," Timothy explained. "The lights, the size, the fact that you're moving through the fog. It's easy to mistake in weather like this. They're hoping you're carrying the people they've been searching for." Sarah felt a wave of sympathy for the ghostly searchers, but also a growing fear. "What happens when they realize I'm not a ship? That I don't have the people they're looking for?" Timothy's expression grew serious. "Depends on how disappointed they are. Some of them have been searching for a very long time, and disappointment can turn to anger pretty quickly, especially when they think someone's been deliberately misleading them." The crowd of figures was pressing closer now, their lanterns creating a forest of flickering lights around Sarah's truck. She could hear voices calling out names, asking questions in accents that ranged from modern Maine to dialects so old they were barely recognizable as English. "Have you seen the Morning Star? My husband was on the Liberty Bell. Did she make port? The children were supposed to be on the ferry. Are they safe?" Sarah rolled up her window, suddenly feeling very vulnerable in her modern truck, surrounded by centuries of maritime grief. "Timothy, I need to get out of here. I have a delivery to make." The boy nodded understandingly. "Follow my light. I'll guide you through them, get you back to the road that belongs to your time. But whatever you do, don't stop until you're clear of the fog." Some of the searchers get desperate when they think they've found a ship, and desperate ghosts can be dangerous. Timothy began walking ahead of Sarah's truck, his lantern held high like a beacon. The other figures parted reluctantly, their disappointed voices calling out questions and pleas as Sarah's truck passed through their midst. She kept her eyes fixed on Timothy's light, fighting the urge to look at the faces pressed against her windows, fighting the temptation to stop and try to help people whose problems couldn't be solved by anyone from the world of the living. The fog seemed to go on forever, thick and gray and full of searching lights that appeared and vanished like stars behind clouds. But Timothy's lantern never wavered, never faltered, leading Sarah through the maze of ghostly searchers and back toward the world of modern highways and scheduled deliveries. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the fog began to thin. Sarah could see the familiar white lines of Route 1, could make out the reflective markers that marked the edge of the roadway. Modern civilization was reasserting itself, pushing back the domain of the searchers who walked in the fog. Timothy stopped at the edge of the clear area and turned back toward Sarah's truck. "This is as far as I go, miss. The fog is my territory. The clear road is yours." Sarah rolled down her window one more time. "Timothy, isn't there anything I can do to help you? Some way to end your search?" The boy smiled, the first time Sarah had seen him look genuinely happy. "You've already helped more than you know. Every time someone like you passes through safely, every time a modern traveler makes it home to their family, it gives hope to those of us who never completed our own journeys. That's enough for now." Timothy's figure began to fade as the fog retreated, becoming translucent like an old photograph exposed to too much light. But his voice carried clearly through the clearing air. "Drive safe, miss. And if you ever run into fog like this again, remember, not everyone you meet on the coast road belongs to your century. Some of us are still keeping promises we made a very long time ago." Sarah completed her run to Machias, delivered her load on time, and eventually took other routes that avoided the most remote sections of the Maine coast late at night. But she never forgot her encounter with Timothy Morse and the searchers who walked in the fog, never stopped thinking about the promises that could bind souls to centuries of searching for people and ships that would never return. She researched the maritime history of Machias Bay and found records of the fishing boat that had gone down in 1847, taking Timothy's father and 4 other men to the bottom of the Atlantic. The boy's body had never been found, leading to speculation that he'd tried to swim to shore and been claimed by the same storm that had taken his father's vessel. But Sarah knew better. Timothy hadn't drowned in the storm. He'd kept his promise, had spent almost 2 centuries keeping the light burning for a father who would never return. And in doing so, he'd become something more than human, something that existed between the world of the living and the world of the dead, helping modern travelers navigate the same waters that had claimed so many lives throughout Maine's maritime history. The Coast Road, Sarah learned, was more than just a highway connecting fishing villages and tourist destinations. It was a corridor through time, a place where the accumulated grief and hope of centuries of maritime life still walked in search of closure that might never come. But sometimes, on nights when the fog rolled in from the Atlantic and the boundaries between past and present grew thin, that grief and hope could find new purpose in helping the living complete their own journeys safely. Mark Thompson had been running the Midwest routes for 15 years, and he thought he knew every way station, rest area, and truck stop between Chicago and St. Louis. Illinois might not have the dramatic scenery of Colorado or the maritime history of Maine, but it had its own challenges: unpredictable weather, heavy traffic around major cities, and a DOT enforcement presence that kept professional drivers constantly alert for violations that could cost them their CDL. Interstate 55 through central Illinois was one of Mark's regular routes, a straight shot through farmland and small towns that connected the industrial centers of the Great Lakes with the transportation hubs of the South. It was good, steady freight, automotive parts, machinery, agricultural equipment, the kind of loads that kept American commerce moving and kept experienced drivers employed year-round. Mark was hauling combine harvester components from a John Deere plant outside Chicago to a distributor in Springfield, his flatbed trailer loaded with expensive machinery that represented months of skilled labor and engineering. It was a valuable load, the kind that required careful attention to securement and protection from weather, but it was also routine freight that he'd handled dozens of times before. He'd left the Chicago area at 11 p.m., planning to reach Springfield by dawn with time to spare before the distributor opened. The route was familiar: I-55 south through the suburbs, then into the agricultural heartland of central Illinois, where small towns were connected by endless fields of corn and soybeans. October in Illinois meant harvest season, when the countryside was busy with farming activity during the day but quiet and peaceful at night. Mark was about an hour south of Chicago when he saw the Way Station sign appear in his headlights. Way Station open, all trucks must stop, 2 miles. Mark checked his logbook and load securement, making sure everything was in order for a DOT inspection. His hours were legal, his equipment was well maintained, and his load was properly secured according to federal regulations. But he'd been driving long enough to know that Way Station encounters could be unpredictable. especially late at night when enforcement officers might be looking for easy violations to justify their presence. The weigh station appeared ahead on the right side of the highway, its overhead signs and scale platforms lit by bright sodium lights that turned everything orange and harsh. But as Mark approached the facility, he noticed something odd about its appearance. The buildings looked older than he remembered. The signage was in a style that hadn't been used by the Illinois DOT for decades, and there were no modern electronic scales or computer terminals visible. Mark pulled his truck onto the scale platform and waited for instructions. Usually, a green or red light would indicate whether he needed to proceed to the inspection area or could continue on his way. But tonight, the signals seemed to be manual. A uniformed officer emerged from the office building and walked toward his truck with a clipboard and flashlight. The officer looked like he belonged in a different era. His uniform was cut in a style that Mark recognized from old trucking magazines, probably from the 1960s or 1970s, before modern DOT regulations had standardized enforcement procedures and equipment. His badge was different too, featuring the Illinois state seal, but in a design that hadn't been used for decades. "Evening driver," the officer said as Mark rolled down his window. "License, registration, and logbook, please." Mark handed over his documents, noting that the officer's clipboard was the old-fashioned kind with actual paper forms rather than the electronic tablets that modern enforcement used. "Is this a routine inspection, officer?" "Just checking compliance with federal regulations," the officer replied, examining Mark's CDL with unusual interest. "Says here you've been driving since 2008. That's a pretty recent start date for someone your age." Mark was confused by the comment. He'd started driving in 2008, which gave him 15 years of experience. Hardly a recent start for someone in his mid-40s. But the officer seemed to think 15 years was somehow insufficient experience for the job. "I've got a clean record, officer. No violations, no accidents, current medical certificate." The officer nodded but continued studying the documents with an intensity that made Mark uncomfortable. "Load manifest says you're hauling agricultural equipment. Mind if I take a look at your securement?" "Not at all," Mark replied, though he was puzzled by the request. Flatbed securement was routine, and his load was properly chained and tarped according to current regulations. But the officer's inspection was unlike anything Mark had experienced in 15 years of professional driving. The officer examined his chains and binders with equipment that looked decades out of date, measuring devices that should have been replaced by modern electronic tools, reference materials that cited regulations Mark didn't recognize. And his inspection technique was different too, focusing on securement methods that had been superseded by more advanced systems years ago. "Driver, your chain specifications don't meet current requirements," the officer said finally. Mark was baffled. "Officer, those chains are rated for the load weight and meet all current DOT specifications. I just had them inspected last month. According to my manual, chains must be 3/8 inch minimum diameter with grade 70 working load limit. Yours appear to be some kind of synthetic material I'm not familiar with." Mark realized with growing alarm that the officer was looking at his modern load securement equipment, high-strength synthetic straps and advanced binding systems, and not recognizing them as legitimate securement devices. It was as if he was applying regulations from decades ago to equipment that hadn't existed when those regulations were written. "Officer, those are DOT-approved synthetic securement straps. They're standard equipment for modern flatbed operations." The officer shook his head. "I've never seen equipment like this before. Going to have to write you up for improper securement and require you to resecure your load using approved methods." Mark felt his pulse quicken. A securement violation could result in his truck being placed out of service, his load being delayed, and potentially thousands of dollars in fines and rework. But more importantly, he was certain that his securement met all current federal regulations. "Officer, "Can I see your manual? I'd like to review the specific regulation you're citing." The officer handed over his reference book, and Mark's confusion deepened. The manual was titled Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, 1975 edition. The cover was worn and the pages were yellowed with age, but it appeared to be an original document from nearly 50 years ago. "Officer, this manual is from 1975. Current regulations are significantly different." "What do you mean, current regulations?" "This is the current manual, updated just last year." Mark stared at the officer, trying to understand what was happening. "Officer, what year do you think it is?" 1976, of course. October 22nd, to be exact. Mark felt ice water in his veins. 1976. That was almost 50 years ago, before he was born, before most of the modern trucking industry existed. But he was talking to an enforcement officer who believed it was 1976, who was applying regulations from that era to his modern equipment and documentation. "Officer, I think there's been some kind of mistake. It's 2025, not 1976. The officer looked at Mark with the expression of someone dealing with a potentially dangerous individual. "Driver, are you feeling all right? Have you been using any controlled substances? Because making false statements to a federal officer is a serious violation." Mark realized he was trapped in some kind of impossible situation. He was at a weigh station that seemed to exist in 1976, being inspected by an officer who didn't recognize modern equipment or regulations, with documentation that wouldn't make sense to someone from that era. But he was also carrying a load that needed to be delivered on schedule, with modern freight that couldn't be delayed by bureaucratic confusion from another decade. "Officer, I need to call my dispatcher. This situation requires clarification from higher authority." Mark reached for his cell phone, but the officer immediately became suspicious. "What is that device?" "It's a cell phone. I need to call my company and explain the situation. I've never seen a communication device like that. Looks like some kind of electronic surveillance equipment." "Driver, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle for a more thorough inspection." Mark realized that his modern technology, cell phone, GPS, electronic logs, even his truck's advanced engine and emission controls, would be completely incomprehensible to someone from 1976. He was driving equipment that wouldn't be invented for decades, carrying documentation that referenced regulations that didn't exist yet, trying to communicate with devices that would seem like science fiction to a law enforcement officer from the Ford administration. Mark climbed down from his cab, trying to think of a way to explain his situation without sounding completely insane. But as his feet touched the pavement of the way station, everything changed. The harsh orange lighting flickered and went out. The old-style buildings faded like mirages in desert heat. The officer with his 1975 manual and his confusion about modern equipment simply vanished, leaving Mark standing alone in the darkness beside his truck. Mark looked around, disoriented and confused. He was parked at a weigh station, but not the one he'd entered. This facility was modern, with current signage, electronic scales, and the familiar look of 21st century DOT infrastructure. But it was also closed, with gates across the entrance and signs indicating that it had been shut down for renovation. Mark checked his GPS and realized he was exactly where he should be on I-55, at a weigh station that he'd passed dozens of times in his 15-year career. But according to his electronic logs, he'd lost nearly an hour somewhere between approaching the facility and finding himself parked outside its closed gates. Mark got back in his truck and continued toward Springfield, but he couldn't shake the memory of his encounter with the officer from 1976. He'd experienced something that couldn't be explained by fatigue or highway hypnosis. He'd somehow encountered a weigh station that existed in a different decade, staffed by enforcement personnel who were applying regulations from an era when trucking was fundamentally different from the modern industry. At the truck stop in Springfield, Mark asked other drivers if they'd ever had unusual experiences at Illinois way stations. Most of them looked at him like he was suffering from too much caffeine or not enough sleep. But one older driver, a man named Bill who'd been running Midwest routes since the 1970s, listened carefully to his story. "You're talking about the old Pontiac way station," Bill said finally. "Been closed for renovation for about 5 years now, but drivers still report strange encounters there. Usually guys who are new to the route, don't know the local history." "What kind of history?" Bill leaned back in his booth, his weathered face serious. "Back in the 70s, there was an incident at that way station. DOT officer named Patterson, been working enforcement for 20 years, was killed in a truck accident right there on the scales. Truck had brake failure, crushed him against his own office building." "When did this happen?" "October 1976. Same month you said you had your encounter." Story goes that Patterson was so dedicated to his job, so committed to enforcing safety regulations, that he never really left his post. Still shows up on certain nights, still trying to inspect trucks and enforce the regulations he knew best. Mark felt goosebumps rise on his arms. "You think I encountered the ghost of a DOT officer? I think there are some places where the past and present exist side by side, especially places where people died doing jobs they cared about. And I think Patterson's still trying to do his job, still trying to keep unsafe trucks off the highway, even though the world has changed completely since his time." Mark completed his delivery in Springfield, but he never forgot his encounter at the closed way station. He researched the history of Illinois DOT enforcement and found records of Officer Patterson's death in 1976, along with newspaper accounts that described him as a dedicated professional who took pride in keeping dangerous vehicles off the highway. Mark also learned that the way station had been built in 1974 and had operated continuously until 2020, when it was closed for modernization that had been delayed by budget constraints and bureaucratic complications. During its 46 years of operation, it had processed hundreds of thousands of commercial vehicles and had been the site of numerous enforcement actions that had prevented accidents and saved lives. But some of those enforcement actions, Mark realized, were still taking place. Officer Patterson was still at his post, still trying to protect the traveling public by enforcing the safety regulations he'd learned during his career. The fact that those regulations were decades out of date, that modern trucking had evolved beyond his understanding, didn't change his commitment to the job that had cost him his life. The way station, Mark concluded, was more than just a facility for checking truck weights and inspecting equipment. It was a place where dedication to public safety had transcended death itself, where a law enforcement officer continued his patrol decades after his shift should have ended. But that dedication came with challenges for modern drivers who encountered Patterson's ghost. The trucking industry had changed dramatically since 1976, and equipment that was standard today would be incomprehensible to someone from that era. Modern drivers caught between worlds might find themselves cited for violations that didn't exist, or praised for compliance with regulations that had been superseded decades ago. Mark never drove past the closed way station late at night again, preferring to time his trips through that section of I-55 during daylight hours when the boundaries between past and present seemed more clearly defined. Because some enforcement he'd learned never really ended, and some officers never really went off duty, no matter how much the world changed around them. Rebecca Martinez had been driving Pacific Northwest routes for 9 years, but she'd only been running the Oregon coastal highways for the past year. The scenery was spectacular, towering cliffs, dense forests, and views of the Pacific Ocean that could take your breath away. But the roads were some of the most challenging she'd encountered in her trucking career. Narrow lanes carved into mountainsides, steep grades with no room for error, and weather that could change from clear skies to impenetrable rain in a matter of minutes. Highway 101 along the Oregon coast was particularly demanding, especially the section north of Florence that wound through the Siuslaw National Forest. The highway climbed and descended through terrain that seemed designed to test every skill a professional driver could develop, with curves that required constant attention and grades that could overheat an engine or burn out brakes if you weren't careful. Rebecca was hauling lumber from a mill near Coos Bay to a distributor in Portland, her flatbed trailer loaded with finished dimensional lumber that represented weeks of work by skilled craftsmen. It was a valuable load, the kind that required careful attention to securement and protection from the Pacific Northwest's notorious rain, but it was also routine freight that she'd handled many times since beginning her Oregon routes. She'd left Coos Bay at midnight, planning to reach Portland by dawn with time to spare before the distributor opened. The route was familiar by now, Highway 101 north along the coast, then inland through the mountains to connect with Interstate 5 for the final approach to Portland. It was a beautiful drive during the day, but at night, especially during Oregon's rainy season, it became a test of concentration and skill that demanded complete attention from even experienced drivers. Rebecca was about 50 miles north of Florence when she approached the Ch.8 Head Tunnel, a quarter-mile bore through solid rock that allowed Highway 101 to continue along the coast without having to climb over the massive headland that jutted into the Pacific Ocean. The tunnel was a marvel of 1960s engineering, but it had always made Rebecca slightly uncomfortable. Something about driving through solid rock felt unnatural, like violating some fundamental boundary between human transportation and the ancient geology of the Oregon coast. The tunnel entrance appeared in her headlights, a black mouth carved into the cliff face with overhead lighting that seemed dimmer than she remembered. Rebecca downshifted and entered the tunnel, her truck joining the handful of other vehicles making the crossing. The tunnel was well ventilated and properly lit, but there was something about the enclosed space that always made her feel slightly claustrophobic. But tonight, something was different about the Ch.8 Head Tunnel. As Rebecca drove through the bore, she noticed that the lighting seemed to be pulsing, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that reminded her of breathing. The walls themselves seemed to be moving slightly, expanding and contracting as if the tunnel were alive somehow. Rebecca slowed her truck, thinking there might be some kind of construction work or maintenance activity that was affecting the tunnel's normal operation. But there were no work crews, no equipment, no signs of any kind of official activity. Just the strange pulsing of the lights and the subtle movement of the walls that suggested the tunnel was breathing like a living organism. That was impossible, of course. Tunnels were carved from solid rock, lined with concrete and steel, designed to remain stable for decades or centuries. They didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't exhibit any characteristics of living things. But Rebecca could see the movement, could feel it in the way her truck suspension responded to the subtle changes in the tunnel floor. The Ch.8 Head Tunnel was breathing, and each breath seemed to be drawing her deeper into something that couldn't be explained by engineering or geology. Rebecca tried her CB radio, hoping to raise another driver who might have noticed the same phenomenon. Northbound Highway 101 in the Ch.8 Head Tunnel. Anyone else noticing unusual conditions in here? The response came immediately, but it wasn't from another trucker. It was a voice that seemed to come from the tunnel itself, echoing off the walls with a resonance that made Rebecca's teeth ache. "Welcome to the passage between worlds, driver. You are traveling through more than just rock and concrete tonight." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. "Who is this? Identify yourself." "I am the voice of the deep places, the spirit of stone and water and the slow patience of geological time. This tunnel is more than human engineering. It is a doorway, a passage through barriers that normally separate different kinds of existence." Rebecca wanted to dismiss the voice as some kind of radio interference or practical joke, but the tunnel's breathing was becoming more pronounced, more obvious. The walls were definitely moving now, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that seemed to match her own heartbeat. "This isn't real," Rebecca said into her microphone. "Tunnels don't breathe, don't talk, don't act like living things." Reality is more flexible than most humans understand, the voice replied, especially in places where human construction intersects with much older forces. This headland has been breathing for millions of years, long before your species existed. The tunnel you've carved through it simply allows you to experience that breathing more directly. Rebecca looked ahead, expecting to see the familiar circle of light that marked the tunnel's exit. But instead of the expected opening onto the Oregon coast, she saw only more tunnel, stretching endlessly into darkness. The quarter-mile bore that should have taken maybe 30 seconds to traverse had somehow become much longer, much deeper than any human construction project. "How long is this tunnel?" Rebecca asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "As long as it needs to be," the voice replied. "Tonight, it connects not just one side of the headland to the other, but different layers of time, different versions of the coast that have existed throughout geological history. You are traveling through millions of years of Oregon's development, seeing the land as it was, as it is, and as it will be." Rebecca realized that the tunnel walls were changing as she drove. What had started as modern concrete and steel construction was becoming rougher, more organic, like natural cave formations. And the lighting was changing too, shifting from artificial illumination to something that seemed to come from the rock itself, a phosphorescent glow that suggested minerals or organisms that existed deep underground. "What do you want from me?" Rebecca asked. "Nothing that you cannot freely give," the voice replied. "I want you to witness, to remember, to carry the knowledge that the human world exists within a much larger, much older context. Your highways and tunnels and cities are temporary impositions on landscapes that have their own purposes, their own consciousness." The tunnel continued to stretch ahead, but now Rebecca could see things in the rock walls that definitely didn't belong in any modern construction project. Fossils, but not static museum pieces. These were moving, living, showing her what the Oregon coast had looked like when it was covered by ancient seas millions of years ago. She saw marine reptiles swimming through rock as if it were water, saw forests of plants that had been extinct since long before humans evolved, saw the slow dance of continents and ocean basins that had created the landscape she drove through every day. "This is the deep history of your route," the voice explained. "Every highway exists within layers of time, but most drivers only see the present moment. Tonight, you are experiencing the full temporal depth of the Oregon coast." Rebecca was both terrified and fascinated by what she was seeing. The tunnel had become a passage through time itself, showing her the geological processes that had created the landscape she'd been driving through for the past year without really understanding its origins. But she was also aware that she had a delivery to make, a schedule to keep, responsibilities in the modern world that couldn't be delayed by journeys through geological time. "How do I get back to my own time?" she asked. "You never left your own time," the voice replied. "You are simply experiencing it from a broader perspective. But if you wish to return to your normal perception of reality, simply acknowledge what you have seen and accept the responsibility that comes with that knowledge." "What responsibility?" "To remember that the roads you travel exist within a living landscape, one that has its own purposes and its own consciousness. To drive with respect for the forces that created the terrain you cross every day. To understand that human transportation is a temporary overlay on much older, much more powerful systems." Rebecca nodded, though she wasn't sure the voice could see her gesture. "I understand. I'll remember." The tunnel began to change again, the ancient rock formations gradually giving way to modern concrete and steel. The phosphorescent glow faded, replaced by familiar artificial lighting. And ahead, Rebecca could finally see the circle of light that marked the tunnel's exit onto the Oregon coast. But as her truck emerged from the Heceta Head Tunnel, Rebecca looked back and saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the infrastructure she'd been using for the past year. The tunnel entrance was gone. Not closed, not blocked, but completely absent. Where the opening in the cliff face should have been, there was only solid rock, as if the tunnel had never existed at all. Rebecca pulled over at the next safe spot and checked her GPS, her maps, her route documentation. According to every source she could consult, the Ch.8 Head Tunnel was real, was exactly where she remembered it being, was a standard part of Highway 101's route along the coast. But when she looked back toward the headland, she could see no sign of any tunnel, no indication that human engineering had ever carved a passage through the ancient rock formation. Rebecca completed her run to Portland, but she never forgot her journey through the tunnel that breathed, the passage that had shown her the deep history of the landscape she'd been driving through without understanding its true nature. She researched the geology of the Oregon coast and learned that the Ch.8 Head Formation was indeed millions of years old, created by volcanic activity and ocean processes that had shaped the region long before humans existed. The tunnel had been built in the 1960s as part of a highway improvement project, but the rock it passed through contained fossils and mineral formations that told the story of Oregon's ancient past. Rebecca also learned that other drivers had reported unusual experiences in coastal tunnels throughout the Pacific Northwest, stories of passages that seemed longer than they should be, of voices that spoke from the rock itself, of journeys that revealed the deep history hidden beneath modern highway infrastructure. But most importantly, Rebecca learned to drive with a new awareness of the landscape she traveled through every day. She understood now that the highways she used were temporary impositions on terrain that had its own purposes, its own consciousness, its own ways of communicating with those who were willing to listen. The Oregon coast, she realized, was more than just scenic backdrop for tourism and commerce. It was a living system that connected the present moment with millions of years of geological history. And sometimes, when conditions were right, that system allowed modern travelers to experience the full depth of time that lay beneath their wheels. Rebecca never encountered the breathing tunnel again, but she never forgot the lesson it had taught her about the relationship between human transportation and the ancient forces that had created the landscapes through which that transportation moved. She drove with greater respect for the terrain, greater awareness of the responsibility that came with crossing landscapes that had been shaped by powers far greater and far older than human engineering. Because some roads, she had learned, were more than just connections between human destinations. Some roads were passages through time itself, bridges between the temporary world of human activity and the permanent world of geological processes that would continue long after the last truck had made its final delivery. So there you have it, 10 stories from 10 different states, 10 encounters with the unexplained phenomena that professional drivers sometimes experience in the darkest hours of the night. From the phantom convoy in Alaska's frozen wilderness to the breathing tunnel on Oregon's rugged coast, these tales remind us that America's highways carry more than just commerce and travelers. They carry history, mystery, and the accumulated experiences of millions of people who've crossed this continent in search of work, opportunity, and home. And sometimes, in the small hours when the boundary between reality and imagination grows thin, those highways reveal secrets that most of us will never encounter, but that truck drivers, those knights of the road who see America at its most raw and honest, sometimes witness in all their terrifying glory. These stories come from the men and women who spend their lives on the highway, who know the difference between fatigue-induced hallucination and genuine encounters with forces that can't be explained by conventional logic. They're the custodians of America's strangest road stories, the keepers of tales that remind us how much mystery still exists in our seemingly mapped and measured world. Sweet dreams and safe travels. And remember, the next time you're driving late at night and see something that doesn't quite make sense, you might not be hallucinating. You might just be encountering one of the many secrets that America's highways keep hidden until the right moment to reveal them. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling tales from America's highways, you won't want to miss our next terrifying journey into the unknown. Click the end screen to watch 10 American Truck Driver Horror Stories Part 1, where we dive even deeper into the darkest encounters on our nation's roads. Trust me, you'll want to keep the lights on for that one.